I spent 23 hours on a cramped bus holding a handcrafted wooden crib just to see my first grandson take his first breath. Instead of welcoming me, my own flesh and blood looked at me through the hospital glass and told the nurses to call security. I did not scream or cause a scene. I just turned around and took that same 23-hour bus ride back home to Chicago. But my daughter-in-law's cruelty was not just about pride or prejudice. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a message that revealed exactly why she did not want me anywhere near that hospital administration desk. She had stolen my identity to foot a $22,000 luxury medical bill. My name is Leroy Washington. I am 69 years old, and for decades I built skyscrapers as a lead construction engineer. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air in Seattle was bitterly cold the morning I arrived at the maternity ward. My joints ached from the 23-hour bus ride from Chicago, but I hardly noticed the pain. In my arms I carried a solid cherry wood crib. I had spent the last 3 months carving every spindle and sanding every edge by hand. It was my gift to my newborn grandson, Marcus. It was a piece of my heart meant to welcome a new life into our family. I walked down the sterile white hallway with a smile that I could not wipe off my face. But when I reached the recovery room, that smile was wiped away from me. Through the large glass window, I saw my son Kendrick standing next to the hospital bed. In the bed was his wife Megan, holding a small bundle wrapped in blue blankets. I tapped lightly on the glass. Megan looked up. The moment her eyes met mine, her expression hardened into a mask of pure disgust. She said something sharply to Kendrick. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and sweat in my body, looked at me, then immediately dropped his gaze to the floor. He would not even make eye contact. A moment later, a nurse stepped out of the room and closed the door tightly behind her. "I am sorry, sir," she said with a sympathetic but firm voice. "The mother has requested no family allowed right now. She says this is a private moment." The door cracked open slightly as another nurse walked by, and I heard Megan's voice echoing clear as a bell. "Do not let him in here, Kendrick. Tell that old man to leave. I do not want him ruining my aesthetic today." A different man might have yelled. A foolish man might have banged on the glass and demanded his rights as a grandfather. I did neither. I have lived 69 years in America as a black man, and I learned a long time ago that raising your voice only gives people a reason to dismiss you as angry or crazy. I stood there in the quiet hallway looking down at my hands. These hands had built commercial high-rises across Illinois. These hands had gripped cold steel and poured concrete, working double shifts for years to put Kendrick through an expensive business school. Now my knuckles were swollen with arthritis, a dull, constant throb that flared up in the Seattle rain. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the sharp stabbing ache in my chest. Gwendolyn. My late wife had always told me that Kendrick was weak when it came to Megan. Megan was a white woman from a family that loved to pretend they had old money. From the day Kendrick brought her home, she looked down her nose at us. She scoffed at our neighborhood. She criticized the food Gwendolyn cooked. And Kendrick, desperate for her validation, let her do it. I thought the birth of a child might change things. I thought seeing the grandfather who traveled across the country to deliver a handmade gift might soften her heart. I was wrong. I looked at the cherry wood crib in my hands. The wood was polished perfectly smooth, holding the warmth of the countless hours I spent dreaming about my grandson. I gently placed the crib on the linoleum floor right next to the nurse's station. "Just make sure the baby gets this," I told the nurse quietly. Then I turned my back on the room where my only son was hiding from me. I walked down the long corridor, took the elevator to the ground floor, and stepped out into the pouring rain. I walked all the way back to the Greyhound station. I bought a ticket for the very next bus departing for Chicago. For 23 hours, I sat by a smudged window watching the landscape roll by. My phone sat silent in my pocket. Kendrick did not call to apologize. He did not text to explain. He simply let me leave. When I finally stepped off the bus back in Chicago, the familiar chill of the Midwest wind hit my face. My bones were completely exhausted. My soul felt heavy. I decided to walk the last few blocks to my house. I just wanted to go home. I wanted to sit in the living room that Gwendolyn and I had paid off over 30 years. I wanted to sink into my old armchair and try to figure out where I had gone so wrong in raising my son. As I reached the corner of my street, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. For a brief second, a foolish sliver of hope sparked in my chest. Maybe it was Kendrick. Maybe he finally found his spine and was calling to show me a picture of little Marcus. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the screen. It was an automated text message, but it was not from my son. It was from the billing department of Seattle General Hospital. The message read exactly like this: "Thank you, Leroy Washington, for your prompt electronic signature. Your financial guarantor paperwork has been processed successfully." I stopped walking, right there on the sidewalk. "Financial guarantor paperwork," I whispered out loud. I had not signed a single piece of paper at that hospital. I had not even made it past the hallway. I clicked the secure link attached to the text message. A digital document loaded on my screen displaying a highly detailed invoice for a premium maternity suite. It included room upgrades, imported meals, and luxury care packages that went far beyond standard insurance coverage. The total amount due was $22,000. I scrolled down to the bottom of the electronic form. There, sitting right on the digital signature line, was my name. Someone had signed as Leroy Washington, naming me as the primary account holder responsible for the entire $22,000 balance. The shock hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, everything made terrifying sense. Megan did not just ban me from the hospital room because she was ashamed of me or because she hated my presence. She banned me because she knew that if I spoke to the administration desk or lingered around the nurses' station, I would find out what they had done. She had stolen my identity to finance her luxury birth experience. This was not just a disrespectful daughter-in-law anymore. This was federal identity theft, and my son had stood right beside her and let her do it. I did not walk home. The exhaustion in my bones evaporated entirely. It was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline that coursed through my veins. I turned on my heel and marched straight toward the First National Bank branch on 43rd Street. The harsh Chicago wind whipped against my face, but I felt absolutely nothing. My mind was entirely focused on the numbers. $22,000. That was a sum of money that could break a man my age. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank and walked directly to the teller's desk, ignoring the small ache in my knees. I recognized her immediately. It was Sarah, a kind woman who had helped Gwendolyn and me balance our accounts for the past 15 years. I handed her my driver's license and asked her to pull up my primary retirement account. She smiled warmly at first, but as her hands moved across the keyboard and her eyes scanned the computer monitor, her expression shifted into a look of deep concern. "Mr. Washington," she said softly, leaning closer to the glass partition so the other customers could not hear. "Did you authorize a wire transfer this morning?" I gripped the edge of the wooden counter until my knuckles turned white. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. "No, Sarah, I did not. How much was taken?" She turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. $5,000, she replied. "It was processed as an initial down payment to Seattle General Hospital. It is set up as an automatic recurring withdrawal. They are going to pull $5,000 every month until the full balance is cleared." I stared at the red numbers glowing on the screen. $5,000. That was a quarter of the emergency fund I had carefully built after Gwendolyn passed away. It was money meant to keep me out of a nursing home, money meant to ensure I would never be a burden to my son. And now my son had reached across the country and snatched it right out of my hands. I asked Sarah to print out the authorization forms the hospital had submitted to the bank. I needed to see exactly how this was done. She clicked her mouse a few times and the printer hummed to life. She handed me a stack of warm papers. I put on my reading glasses and examined the first page. It was a digital scan of a physical financial guarantor agreement. The itemized list included a private luxury suite, imported catered meals, and a specialized postnatal massage therapist. They had spared absolutely no expense. At the bottom was a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. The loop of the L and the sharp slant of the W were perfectly replicated. Anyone else would have looked at that document and sworn I had signed it myself, but they did not know the man who forged it. I ran my calloused index finger over the blue ink. I stared at the very end of my last name. The letter N. The tail of the N had a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. It wavered just a fraction of an inch off the baseline. My chest tightened so hard it became difficult to breathe. I recognized that tremor instantly. When Kendrick was 14 years old, he took a bad fall during a high school football game and fractured his right wrist. He wore a cast for 3 long months. I spent every single evening sitting with him at our kitchen table, helping him practice his handwriting so he would not fall behind in his classes. Even after the cast came off, the bones never healed perfectly. Whenever Kendrick wrote quickly or felt anxious, his hand would betray him. The tail of his letters, specifically the letter N, would shake. Megan did not forge this document. Megan might have demanded the luxury maternity suite, but she did not hold the pen. Kendrick did. My own son, the boy I had patiently taught to write, had sat in a hospital waiting room, traced his father's signature, and knowingly committed federal fraud. He sold my financial security to buy his wife imported meals and upgraded silk sheets for her delivery. The betrayal mutated into something far more sinister than disrespect. It was a calculated crime. Kendrick knew my account routing numbers. He knew my social security number. He knew exactly how much money I had saved because I had trusted him with that information when Gwendolyn died. He weaponized my grief and my trust to rob me. I folded the papers and placed them inside my coat pocket. "Thank you, Sarah," I said quietly. "Please freeze this account immediately. Do not allow another cent to leave." I left the bank with a singular mission. I was not going to absorb this blow. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let my entitled daughter-in-law and my cowardly son drain my life savings. I needed to hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a ruthless one. Someone who specialized in identity theft and elder financial abuse. But lawyers of that caliber required a hefty retainer, and with my primary account frozen, I needed collateral. I decided to go home and retrieve the deed to my house. Gwendolyn and I had paid off the mortgage 5 years ago. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom property in a quiet neighborhood. I could use the equity in the house to secure a line of credit, hire the best attorney in Chicago, and drag Seattle General Hospital and my son into federal court. I walked the remaining blocks to my street with a newfound sense of iron purpose. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shiny. I approached my house, admiring the sturdy oak porch I had rebuilt with my own hands. Every brick and every plank of wood held a memory of the life I had built for my family. This was the house where I had carried Gwendolyn over the threshold. This was the house where Kendrick had taken his first steps. I climbed the steps, took a deep breath, and reached into my pocket for my keychain. I found the familiar, heavy brass key that had unlocked my front door for 3 decades. I slid it into the deadbolt. It went in halfway and stopped. I jiggled it. I pushed a little harder, thinking the cold metal had contracted in the weather. It did not budge. I pulled the key out and looked at the doorknob. The brass fixture was gone. In its place was a brand new brushed nickel lock set. It was completely spotless, without a single scratch. I stood there on the porch of the house I owned, staring at a piece of metal that made no logical sense. My key did not fit because the locks had been entirely replaced. I stepped back from the solid oak door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I walked down the porch steps and stood on the wet sidewalk, looking up at the 2-story colonial house I had called home for 3 decades. The sky above Chicago was turning a bruised gray, and a cold drizzle began to fall, but I did not seek shelter. My eyes were glued to the large front bay window. Taped to the inside of the glass facing the street was a stark white sign with bold red lettering. It read, "Sold." Below that, in smaller print, it listed the name of a corporate real estate development firm. I blinked, rubbing the cold rain from my eyes, hoping it was some sort of cruel prank. But the sign remained. This was the house where Gwendolyn and I had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners. This was the yard where I had taught Kendrick how to throw a baseball. I had personally replaced the roof. I had sanded the hardwood floors. We had paid off the 30-year mortgage 5 years ago. I held the deed in a fireproof lockbox under my bed. It was legally and entirely mine. There was no conceivable way this property could be sold without my physical presence, my explicit consent, and my signature. Yet the brushed nickel lock on the door and the corporate sign in the window told a completely different story. A stranger now owned the walls that held my entire history. The sheer audacity of it paralyzed me for a moment. My own son had not only stolen $22,000 from my retirement account, but he had somehow managed to sell the roof over my head while I was sitting on a bus traveling to see his newborn child. I stood there, letting the freezing rain soak through my heavy wool coat. The neighborhood was quiet. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when I left for Seattle, but my reality had been entirely erased. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but my resolve was absolute. I dialed Kendrick's number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. He did not say hello. He did not ask if I had made it back to Chicago safely. "Dad, what do you want?" he asked. His tone was clipped and annoyed, like I was a telemarketer interrupting his dinner. "I am standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, Kendrick," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "There is a new lock on the door and a sold sign in the window. I want you to explain to me exactly what you did." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background and Megan's voice murmuring something I could not catch. When Kendrick spoke again, his voice was completely devoid of warmth. "I sold the house, Dad. The closing went through yesterday morning while you were on the bus. You sold my house," I repeated, gripping the phone so tightly the plastic case cracked. "How did you sell a house that belongs to me?" "I used the power of attorney you signed 3 years ago," he replied smoothly. The memory hit me like a physical punch to the gut. 3 years ago, the week after Gwendolyn passed away, I was a broken man. I could barely get out of bed. Kendrick had come over with a stack of legal documents. He told me it was standard tax paperwork required to transfer Gwendolyn's life insurance and consolidate our estate. He said he was taking the burden off my shoulders so I could grieve. I signed where he pointed without reading a single paragraph. I had trusted my son. "You used a document I signed in grief to render me homeless," I asked. "Why?" "Because I needed the capital, Dad," he snapped, his voice rising defensively. "My tech startup was running out of runway. The investors were threatening to pull out. And Megan refused to bring Marcus back to our cramped 2-bedroom apartment. She wanted a proper house in the suburbs. A newly built mansion with a nursery and a yard. Your house was old. The layout was outdated. I liquidated the asset to save my company and provide for my growing family. You should be happy I am securing our future. You stole my identity to pay a hospital bill and you sold my home to buy your wife a mansion," I said. "What exactly am I supposed to do now, Kendrick? Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" He let out an exasperated sigh, as if my homelessness was a minor inconvenience he had to manage. "Look, Dad, the money is tied up in the new property and my business accounts. There is nothing left to give you. Megan and I talked about it, and we think it is time you look into a state-run nursing home. We already packed up your clothes and put them in a storage unit. I will text you the address and the gate code. The first month is paid for. After that, you are on your own. Go to a nursing home, Dad. It is for the best. Megan says you need professional care anyway." Before I could respond, he disconnected the call. The dial tone echoed in my ear, blending with the sound of the falling rain. I lowered the phone from my ear and let my arm drop to my side. I stood completely alone on the pavement outside the house I had built my life in. The freezing rain washed over my face, masking the hot tears that escaped my eyes. Any normal man would have broken down right there. Any normal 69-year-old man would have collapsed onto the wet grass, devastated by the realization that his only son had stripped him of his wealth, his home, and his dignity. The audience to this cruel play would think I had lost everything. They would look at an old black man standing in the rain and see nothing but a tragic victim destined to rot in a terrible state-funded facility. But they did not know Gwendolyn, and neither did Kendrick. I wiped the rain from my face and took a deep breath of the sharp Chicago air. I looked at the dark windows of the house one last time. I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, calculating clarity settle over my mind. Kendrick was a fool. He was so blinded by Megan's demands and his own inflated ego that he thought a simple suburban house and a retirement account were the extent of my net worth. He thought that by weaponizing that power of attorney, he had drained me dry. But my brilliant wife had always been 10 steps ahead. Gwendolyn was an accountant who understood the harsh realities of the world. Years ago, she had decided that our visible assets, the house, the cars, the standard bank accounts, would just be a facade. Our true wealth, the real legacy we had built over 40 years of smart investments, was locked away in a place Kendrick knew absolutely nothing about. The house he just sold was nothing but an empty shell. He thought he had left me with nothing, but he had just handed me the key to his own destruction. I turned my back on the property and walked away into the rain, ready to unleash a financial war he could never win. I did not go to a hotel downtown. I did not check into a place with a concierge or clean sheets. If my son and his wife wanted me to be a broken homeless old man, I was going to play the part flawlessly. I walked through the freezing Chicago rain until I reached a transit station. I took the red line south and found the cheapest, most rundown motel I could find. The neon sign outside buzzed with a missing letter, and the clerk behind the bulletproof glass did not even look up when I paid for a week in cash. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. The wallpaper was peeling at the seams. It was the perfect war room. Earlier, I had taken a cab to the storage unit Kendrick texted me about. Inside, I found my life carelessly thrown into cheap cardboard boxes. But the only thing I cared about was my old battered leather suitcase. I carried it into the motel room and locked the flimsy door behind me. I set the suitcase on the squeaky mattress. I did not open it to look at the clothes my son had packed for my exile. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folding knife. I ran my thumb along the bottom edge of the suitcase, feeling for the hidden seam. With a swift, precise motion, I sliced the thick leather lining wide open. I reached deep inside the false bottom and pulled out a heavy, waterproof folio. I sat on the edge of the bed and unzipped it, spreading the documents across the faded blanket. These papers were the culmination of my wife's genius. Gwendolyn had been a brilliant corporate accountant. While I physically built skyscrapers, she built a financial empire from the ground up. We lived simply because Gwendolyn believed that visible wealth only attracted parasites. Every bonus I earned, every penny we saved, she invested into a private holding company we named Gwen Holdings. Over the decades, Gwen Holdings had acquired strip malls, commercial real estate complexes, and a highly lucrative private lending firm. The portfolio was worth tens of millions of dollars. Kendrick thought he had taken my only asset because he only saw the modest house and the simple retirement account. He never knew that the man he threw out onto the street was the primary shareholder of a massive corporate network. I stared at the documents, feeling Gwendolyn's protective spirit surrounding me. It was time to use the power she had secured for us. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a number I had not called since Gwendolyn passed away. The phone rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. Jonathan Pierce was not a small-town lawyer. He was a ruthless, high-powered corporate attorney who managed the legal affairs for Gwen Holdings. He charged thousands of dollars an hour, and he earned every single cent. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and right now I needed a shark. "Leroy," he said, his voice laced with surprise. "It has been 3 years. I did not expect to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right?" "No, Jonathan. Everything is not all right," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I need you to go to your office right now. We have a situation that requires your immediate and full attention. My son Kendrick has declared war on me." I heard the sound of a chair scraping back. Jonathan did not ask if it could wait until morning. "Tell me exactly what happened, Leroy." I laid out the facts with cold precision. I told him about the $22,000 hospital bill in Seattle and the forged signature. I told him how Kendrick had used the old power of attorney document I signed in grief to sell my house out from under me. I explained that I was currently sitting in a cheap motel room while my son thought I was destitute and on my way to a state-run nursing home. For a moment, there was absolute silence on the line. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Leroy, that is federal identity theft, elder, financial abuse, and real estate fraud. I can have a judge freeze all of his assets by tomorrow morning. We can have Kendrick and his wife in handcuffs before the weekend. Give me the word and I will destroy them legally and financially." I looked down at the Gwen Holdings documents on the bed. "No," I said flatly. "Do not touch them yet. If we strike now, they will play the victims. Kendrick will claim it was a misunderstanding or a desperate mistake to save his business. I do not want to just slap him on the wrist, Jonathan. I want to watch him hang himself with his own rope. I want to cut off his air supply slowly so he understands exactly who he crossed." "What are your orders?" Jonathan asked, entirely shifting into battle mode. "I need you to audit every single cent that has moved through Kendrick's accounts over the last 30 days," I commanded. "I want to know exactly where the money from my house went. I want to know the real financial health of his tech startup. Tear his financial life apart down to the last penny and bring me the pieces. I need to know his vulnerabilities before I start pulling the strings. Give me 2 hours, Leroy. I will call you back with everything." I spent the next 2 hours sitting in the dim light of the motel room reviewing the corporate structures of Gwen Holdings. The buzzing neon sign outside cast a red glow over the papers. I was a wealthy man sitting in a pauper's cell orchestrating the downfall of my own flesh and blood. It was a heavy burden, but my son had left me absolutely no choice. He had chosen money over his father, so I was going to teach him the true weight of money. Exactly 2 hours later, my phone lit up with Jonathan's name. I answered immediately. "What did you find, Jonathan?" "Leroy, your son is an absolute fool." Jonathan began, his tone dripping with professional disdain. "I pulled the public records and traced the wire transfers from the sale of your home. First of all, you need to know that Kendrick is lying about his business. His tech startup is completely bankrupt. He has not secured any new investors in over a year. The company is drowning in debt and has zero operational revenue. So he used the money from my house to pay off his business debts," I asked, trying to piece the puzzle together. "No," Jonathan said sharply. "That is the most interesting part. Kendrick did not put a single dollar of the $400,000 from your house sale into his startup. He did not use it to pay his business creditors at all." I frowned, staring at the peeling wallpaper across the room. Kendrick had specifically told me he liquidated my house to save his company and buy a new mansion for Megan. "Where did the $400,000 go, Jonathan?" "It was wired directly to an escrow account for a premium real estate purchase," Jonathan explained. "The funds cleared yesterday morning, so he bought the mansion for Megan," I said, my jaw clenching at the thought of my wife's legacy funding my daughter-in-law's luxury lifestyle. Jonathan paused, and I could hear the rustle of papers on his desk. "Leroy, your son did not buy a suburban mansion with that cash. The money from your house was used to purchase a luxury downtown penthouse outright in cash. But here is the catch." "What is the catch, Jonathan?" "I am looking at the property deed right now," Jonathan said, his voice completely serious. "Kendrick is not on the title. Megan is not on the title either. The money from your lifelong home was used to buy a luxury property, but the names on the deed do not belong to anyone named Washington. Your son funneled $400,000 to someone else entirely." Jonathan's voice cut through the heavy silence of my motel room like a surgical blade. "The names on the deed are Richard and Susan Gallagher." The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Richard and Susan Gallagher. Megan's parents. The very same people who had refused to eat Gwendolyn's cooking at the rehearsal dinner, claiming it was too heavy for their refined palates. The same people who constantly bragged about their prestigious country club memberships, their European summer vacations, and their supposed old money lineage. They had always treated Kendrick like a charity project, a diversity quota their daughter was fulfilling, and they looked at me like I was simply the hired help who had wandered into the wrong dining room. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling the plastic creak under my calloused fingers. "Jonathan, tell me you are absolutely certain about this," I demanded. "I have the official county property records right in front of me, Leroy." Jonathan replied, his tone entirely serious. "Kendrick transferred the entire $400,000 from your house sale into a private trust account controlled strictly by Megan. From there, the money went straight to an escrow company to finalize the purchase of a luxury high-rise condominium in the financial district. The title of that property is exclusively in Richard and Susan Gallagher's names. Neither Kendrick nor Megan are listed anywhere on the deed. But why would Kendrick buy his arrogant in-laws a luxury condo while his own business is completely failing?" I asked, trying to wrap my mind around the sheer madness of his actions. "Because Richard and Susan Gallagher are entirely bankrupt," Jonathan stated matter-of-factly. "I ran a deep background check on their financials. Their entire country club lifestyle was a complete illusion funded by massive credit card debt and reckless personal loans. They lost their previous suburban home to bank foreclosure exactly 3 months ago. They have absolutely zero liquid assets. They were literally days away from living out of their car. The horrifying reality of the situation washed over me in a sickening wave. Megan had not just manipulated my son into funding her luxury hospital stay. She had aggressively manipulated him into liquidating his own father's lifelong home to bail out her deadbeat parents. She had successfully drained the wealth of her black husband's working-class family to secretly maintain the wealthy facade of her white parents. They were using my sweat, my physical sacrifices, and Gwendolyn's careful financial legacy to keep themselves wrapped in luxury while they banished me to a state-funded facility. I thought about the 30 years I spent waking up before dawn, pouring concrete and walking steel beams in the freezing Chicago winters to pay the mortgage on that house. Every single brick was earned with my physical pain. And now, Richard Gallagher, a man who had never done a hard day's work in his life, was sitting in a downtown high-rise paid for by my broken back. Kendrick had completely surrendered his dignity. He had sold out his own flesh and blood to buy the approval of a family that secretly despised him. He had chosen to render his 69-year-old father homeless, rather than let his in-laws face the consequences of their own massive financial failures. The level of betrayal was so deep it bypassed normal anger and settled into a cold, hard, absolute resolve. "Jonathan, send me every single document you just found," I said. "I want the deed, the wire transfer logs, and the Gallagher's sealed bankruptcy records." "Consider it done," Leroy Jonathan replied smoothly. "What is our next move?" "Do nothing yet," I told him, keeping my voice completely level. "Let them get comfortable in their stolen penthouse. Let them pop their expensive champagne and think they have won the lottery. I will call you when it is time to strike." I hung up the phone and stared at the peeling wallpaper of the cheap motel room. The room felt freezing, but the fire burning inside my chest kept me perfectly warm. Suddenly my phone buzzed again in my hand. The caller ID flashed on the screen showing Kendrick's name. I stared at the glowing letters for a moment. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deep breath to clear any trace of anger or strength from my voice. When I finally answered, I made sure to sound deeply exhausted and entirely defeated. "Hello," I muttered softly. "Dad, it is me," Kendrick said. His voice was overly loud, filled with a fake, cheerful tone that made my stomach turn instantly. "I just wanted to check in and see if you made it to the storage unit all right. Did you get the address for the nursing home I sent you?" "I did, Kendrick," I replied, keeping my voice low and flat. "Listen, Dad, I know things happened incredibly fast and I know you might be feeling a little overwhelmed." Kendrick continued, rushing through his words to avoid giving me any chance to argue or complain. "But I want you to know I am not completely abandoning you. Megan and I talked it over at the hospital today. We know the nursing home only provides basic meals and standard care. We want to make sure you are comfortable. So I am going to set up an automatic transfer to your checking account. I am going to send you $300 every single month. You can use it for snacks or new socks or whatever little things you need. $300. He had effectively stolen $400,000 from the sale of my house and $22,000 from my retirement fund. Now he was offering me a $300 monthly allowance out of my own stolen wealth like he was a generous king tossing copper pennies to a starving beggar. He was actively trying to buy off his own guilty conscience for the price of a cheap grocery bill. "That is very generous of you, Kendrick," I said, tasting the bitter bile rising in my throat. "Well, you are my father," Kendrick said, his tone dripping with unearned self-satisfaction. "I take care of my family. But Dad, there are some strict conditions to this arrangement. Megan is very stressed right now with the new baby and the big move. You cannot keep calling us and making a scene. You need to stay at the facility and let us adjust to our new life. You have to promise me you will not cause any trouble. If you try to fight the house sale or if you bother Megan in any way, I will cut off the $300 immediately. Do we have a clear agreement?" I closed my eyes and leaned back against the cheap motel headboard. The sheer arrogance of my son was absolutely staggering. He truly believed he held all the power in the world. He thought he had successfully backed me into a dark corner where I had no choice but to accept his miserable scraps. It was time to give him exactly what he wanted to hear. I forced my hand to shake slightly against the phone receiver, letting out a long, trembling sigh into the microphone. I made my voice crack, simulating the pathetic sound of a broken, defeated old man who had completely surrendered to his grim fate. "I promise, Kendrick," I whispered, my voice quivering perfectly. "I will not cause any trouble for you or Megan. I know I do not have any other options left anymore. I will go to the facility tomorrow morning. Please just send the money. I do not have enough cash left to buy my heart medication this week." I heard Kendrick let out a heavy breath of profound relief on the other end of the line. His biggest problem was officially solved. "Good Dad," he said, his voice instantly returning to its brisk, arrogant, businesslike tone. "I am glad you are finally being reasonable about this situation. I will process the first $300 by Friday afternoon. Get some rest. I will call you in a few weeks when things settle down." He ended the call without even bothering to say goodbye. I lowered the phone from my ear. The exact second the screen went black, the frail, trembling posture I had just faked vanished completely. I stood up from the creaky bed and my spine straightened to its full height. I walked over to the cracked mirror hanging above the motel sink and stared directly at my own reflection. My face was practically carved from solid stone. My eyes were cold, steady, and entirely void of mercy. My son thought he had just won the ultimate war by threatening a helpless old man with starvation. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked blindly into a devastating trap set by a man who held the keys to a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. I placed the phone gently on the counter and smiled a dark, chilling smile. "Enjoy your $300 worth of peace, Kendrick," I said to the empty room, "because it is the last moment of peace you will ever have in your entire life." The next morning, the harsh Chicago daylight filtered through the dirty motel window, but my mind was completely illuminated. I sat at the wobbly wooden desk with the Gwen Holdings portfolio spread out before me, analyzing the financial documents Jonathan had securely emailed over the night. There was still one massive missing piece to this complicated puzzle. If Kendrick had completely drained the $400,000 from my house sale to purchase a luxury downtown condominium for Richard and Susan Gallagher, how exactly was he financing the brand new suburban mansion for Megan? I clicked through the encrypted files Jonathan had provided until I found the real estate closing documents for my son's new primary residence. The purchase price was a staggering $1.2 million. Kendrick had secured a high-risk commercial credit loan to cover the entire cost. Since his tech startup was practically bankrupt and his personal credit was severely overextended, traditional banks had completely laughed him out of their offices. Desperate to satisfy Megan's relentless demands for a sprawling estate, he had turned to the private lending sector. He had pledged the remaining intellectual property of his failing company and his own personal liability to secure the massive loan. I stared at the name of the private credit firm printed at the very top of the lending agreement: Apex Capital Lending. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. Kendrick was so desperate to project an image of wealth and so utterly careless with his paperwork that he had not bothered to look up the parent company of the firm issuing his loan. If he had dug just a little bit deeper, he would have discovered a truth that would have terrified him to his core. Apex Capital Lending was not an independent financial institution. It was a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Gwen Holdings. My late wife Gwendolyn had acquired the private lending firm 12 years ago, specifically to diversify our corporate portfolio into high-yield commercial debt. My son had blindly walked into the open jaws of a massive financial trap. He had financed his wife's dream home by borrowing $1.2 million directly from my own company. He was legally, financially, and entirely indebted to the very man he had just rendered homeless. The irony was so profound it almost took my breath away. Kendrick thought he was playing a high-stakes game of corporate dominance, but he was playing on a board that I completely owned. I immediately picked up my phone and called Jonathan. He answered on the first ring. "Jonathan, I am looking at the Apex Capital Lending contract for Kendrick's new mansion," I said, keeping my voice razor-sharp and focused. "Tell me about the specific terms of this loan and how tightly we hold his leash." I pulled the original file from the Apex archives early this morning. Leroy Jonathan replied, a hint of predatory satisfaction in his sophisticated voice. "Your son signed a highly aggressive variable rate credit agreement. He was so desperate for the cash injection that he agreed to standard commercial penalty clauses without bringing a lawyer to negotiate a single line. He explicitly waived his right to any standard grace periods. What happens if he misses a payment?" I asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear my attorney confirm it. "The default clauses are absolute iron," Jonathan stated firmly. "If he is late on a scheduled payment by even a single day, the contract dictates an immediate acceleration of the debt. Furthermore, the penalty interest rate automatically triggers, pushing his annual percentage rate to the maximum punitive limit allowed by state law. The daily interest alone would be financially destructive, completely suffocating his cash flow." I looked down at the digital signature page where Kendrick's familiar, messy handwriting sealed his own grim fate. "Jonathan, I want you to prepare the legal notices right now," I ordered. "I want the enforcement of this contract to be entirely ruthless. Do not offer any extensions whatsoever. Do not allow any clerical leniency. The second his first payment is overdue, I want the maximum penalty interest rate activated instantly. I want the default mechanism triggered the moment the clock strikes midnight on his due date. Consider the paperwork drafted," Leroy Jonathan agreed without hesitation. "We will have the legal guillotine positioned and ready to drop on his neck. We just need him to stumble and miss his payment." "He will stumble," I replied coldly, visualizing the trap snapping shut. "We are going to make absolutely sure he does." Just as I disconnected the call with Jonathan, a new email notification popped up on my phone screen. It was from the elite private investigation firm Jonathan had retained for me. I needed to know the exact movements and the state of mind of my enemies while I quietly tightened the noose around their necks. The email contained a single encrypted audio file. The subject line read, "Intercepted Conversation Gallagher Residence." I tapped the screen and pressed play. The crisp, clear audio filled my quiet, run-down motel room. It was a recorded phone call between Megan and her mother, Susan. "Oh, Mom, you should see the imported marble countertops in the new kitchen," Megan's voice chirped, dripping with unearned arrogance. "The mansion is absolutely perfect. I am so glad Kendrick finally stepped up and handled his useless father." I heard Susan let out a shrill, mocking laugh. "And the downtown condo is simply divine, darling," she replied. "Your father and I are finally back in the social circles where we belong." "But are you sure that old man is not going to cause any legal trouble for us? He has no money to hire a lawyer." "Mom," Megan scoffed dismissively. "Kendrick told him he would send him $300 a month for snacks at whatever cheap state-run facility takes him. Let that old man rot in there. He served his purpose. Our family is what matters now. We deserve this luxury lifestyle." I sat completely still, letting the sheer venom of my daughter-in-law's words wash over me. She had orchestrated the theft of my life savings, the sale of my home, and the funding of her parents' fraudulent lifestyle without a single ounce of remorse. She viewed my utter destruction as her rightful inheritance. "So, when is the grand reveal?" Susan asked, her tone practically vibrating with greedy excitement. "Next Saturday evening," Megan announced proudly. "We are hosting a massive housewarming party at the new mansion. It is also going to serve as a welcome reception for the baby. I have already sent out luxurious invitations to 200 VIP guests. All the top-tier investors, local politicians, and socialites will be there. We are officially arriving in high society, Mom. It is going to be the event of the year." The audio recording clicked off, leaving me in absolute silence. I slowly lowered the phone to the wooden desk. Megan wanted a grand stage to show off her stolen wealth. She wanted an audience of 200 elite guests to validate her new luxurious life. She was going to get exactly what she wanted. I would let her throw the biggest, most expensive party of her entire life. Because there is no better place to utterly destroy a thief than in front of an audience they desperately want to impress. The trap was fully set, and the countdown to Saturday had officially begun. I woke up the next morning with a very specific performance in mind. If my son and his wife wanted to treat me like a destitute burden, I was going to give them the greatest show of their lives. I went back to the cheap storage unit where Kendrick had dumped my belongings. I dug through the cardboard boxes until I found my oldest, most worn-out work clothes, a pair of faded denim jeans stained with dry concrete from my construction days, a frayed, oversized flannel shirt with a torn collar, a scuffed, heavy winter coat that had seen better decades. I put them on and looked at myself in the cracked mirror of my motel room. I looked exactly like a man who had lost everything. I looked like a man who had been cast out onto the cold Chicago streets by a cruel family. It was the perfect disguise. I left the motel and took the train to the downtown technology district. Kendrick's startup was located in a sleek glass and steel high-rise. It was an expensive illusion of success, built entirely on lies and now funded by my stolen money. I arrived just before noon, knowing this was the exact time Kendrick usually took his potential investors out for expensive lunches to desperately pitch for more capital. I stood near the revolving glass doors of the building, shivering slightly in the brisk wind, letting the cold bite into my bones so my posture would naturally stoop. I waited patiently, watching the suits walk in and out. Then I saw him. Kendrick stepped out of the private elevator lobby, accompanied by 3 older men in expensive tailored suits. These were exactly the kind of venture capitalists Kendrick desperately needed to impress to keep his sinking company afloat. He was laughing loudly at something one of the men said, projecting the image of a successful, brilliant young CEO who had the world at his fingertips. He wore a brand new designer overcoat, undoubtedly purchased with the funds he stole from my retirement account. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward. I dragged my feet slightly as I stepped directly into his path, blocking his way to the upscale steakhouse across the street. "Kendrick," I said, my voice raspy and intentionally loud enough for his wealthy companions to hear. The bright, confident smile on my son's face vanished instantly. His jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his cheeks and then returned in a furious, flushed red. The three investors stopped walking, looking back and forth between the young CEO they were about to fund and the ragged old black man standing in his way. "Kendrick, who is this?" one of the older men asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Kendrick stammered, his smooth business pitch entirely destroyed. He tried to step around me, but I shifted my weight, blocking him again. I reached out a trembling hand, lightly touching the sleeve of his expensive coat. "Please, Kendrick," I begged, making my voice crack with pathetic desperation. "I am so sorry to bother you at work, but you only sent me to that facility with the clothes on my back. I have not eaten since yesterday morning. I need $50 for my heart medication. The pharmacy will not give it to me without the copay, and my account is empty." The investors exchanged highly uncomfortable glances. The image of the successful tech founder was shattering right in front of their eyes, replaced by the horrifying reality of a son who would let his elderly father starve on the street. Kendrick looked like he was going to explode. His eyes darted frantically around the busy sidewalk. He grabbed me by the upper arm, his grip bruising and vicious. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said to the investors, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "This is a private family matter. My father is not well. I will catch up with you at the restaurant in just a moment." He did not wait for their response. He practically dragged me down the sidewalk and shoved me into a narrow concrete alleyway between his office building and the adjacent parking garage. As soon as we were out of sight from his investors, he completely lost his temper. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Are you trying to ruin me? Those men were about to write me a $2 million check. You cannot just show up here looking like a homeless beggar and ask me for loose change." I looked up at him, maintaining my frail, terrified facade. "But Kendrick, I really need the medicine," I whispered. "You took all the money from the house. You took my retirement. I have nothing left. I just need $50. "I do not care what you need," he spat out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I told you I would send you $300 on Friday. You are intentionally trying to embarrass me." Megan was right. You are a manipulative burden. I will not let you destroy the life I am building. He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. He did not hand it to me. He crumpled it into a ball and threw it forcefully onto the dirty, wet pavement at my feet. "Take it and get out of my sight," he sneered. "If you ever come near my office or my new house again, I swear I will have security throw you out. Do not test me, old man." He turned his back on me, adjusting his coat, and marched out of the alleyway, desperately trying to salvage his lunch meeting. I stood alone in the damp alleyway, listening to the sharp click of his expensive leather shoes fading into the distance. The trembling in my hands stopped immediately. The frail, stooped posture vanished. I slowly bent down and picked up the crumpled $20 bill from the wet concrete. I smoothed out the creases with my thumbs, staring at the green paper. My son had just priced his own soul at $20. I looked up from the ground and turned my gaze directly toward the upper corner of the brick wall above me. Right there, mounted perfectly out of casual reach, was a high-definition security camera belonging to the parking garage. The red recording light blinked steadily. It had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire alleyway. It captured the forceful way Kendrick dragged me into the shadows. It captured his aggressive physical posture as he backed me against the wall. It captured him throwing a $20 bill onto the dirt like I was a stray dog. I stared directly into the lens of the camera and allowed a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text message to Jonathan Pierce. "Subpoena, the security footage from the alleyway next to Kendrick's building," I wrote, "occurred at 12:15 p.m. today. I just secured the physical evidence we need." Jonathan replied less than a minute later. "Footage subpoenaed. What exactly does it show?" "It shows physical intimidation, financial withholding, and undeniable elder abuse by a primary power of attorney holder," I typed back. "It is a federal felony." I tucked the $20 bill into my pocket and walked out of the alley with my head held high. Kendrick thought he had just humiliated me. He thought he had successfully defended his fragile ego. He did not realize that the $20 bill he threw in the dirt was the final nail in his coffin. The trap was locked. I had the financial crimes, the identity theft, and now the physical abuse documented on video. The housewarming party was going to be an execution. I returned to my damp motel room and placed the crumpled $20 bill flat on the rickety wooden desk. I smoothed it out one final time, a silent monument to my son's absolute moral bankruptcy. I took off my ragged coat and sat on the edge of the squeaky mattress. Before I could even reach for my laptop to review the next phase of my strategy, My cell phone began to vibrate violently against the nightstand. The caller ID displayed a Seattle area code. I knew exactly who it was. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "Mr. Leroy Washington," a sharp, aggressive female voice demanded. "I am calling from the Central Billing and Collections Department of Seattle General Hospital. My name is Barbara, and this call is being recorded for quality and legal purposes. I am contacting you regarding an outstanding catastrophic balance on your account. I am listening." "Barbara," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any intimidation. "Earlier today, our accounting department attempted to process the initial $5,000 withdrawal from your primary checking account, as stipulated in your signed financial guarantor agreement." Barbara stated, her tone dripping with bureaucratic hostility. "The transaction was categorically declined. Your bank informed us that the account has been frozen due to suspicious activity. Mr. Washington, you currently owe this hospital $22,000 for the premium maternity suite and luxury upgrade packages requested for Megan Washington." I did not interrupt her. I let her build her momentum, knowing exactly how hard she was about to crash into the solid brick wall of reality. "Because you have defaulted on your agreed payment plan, your entire balance is now due immediately." Barbara continued, her voice rising with practiced authority. "If we do not receive a wire transfer for the full $22,000 by the end of this business week, we will be forced to escalate this matter to our aggressive collections agency. We will initiate legal proceedings against you. We will garnish your pension. We will place a rigid lien on your real estate assets, and we will utterly destroy your credit score. Do you understand the severity of this situation, Mr. Washington?" She expected me to panic. She expected an elderly man on a fixed income to break down crying, pleading for a payment plan, or begging for mercy. She expected me to ask for an extension to figure out how to sell my remaining possessions to satisfy their luxury bill. I did not beg. I did not apologize. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and spoke with the cold, calculated authority of a man who managed a corporate empire. "Barbara, I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once." I began, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I did not sign that financial guarantor agreement. I did not authorize a single luxury upgrade for that maternity suite. The signature on your electronic document is a complete forgery." There was a brief pause before Barbara scoffed, her tone shifting from aggressive to highly condescending. "Mr. Washington, we hear this excuse every single day. Family members agree to pay for expensive medical care and then get buyer's remorse when the actual invoice arrives. We have your digital signature on file. We have your routing number. You cannot simply claim fraud to avoid your legal financial responsibilities." I did not raise my voice. I simply tightened the snare. "Barbara, pull up the digital timestamp on that guarantor signature right now," I commanded. "Tell me the exact date, time, and specific terminal location where that electronic pad was signed." I heard the rapid clacking of her keyboard. She was clearly annoyed, but she complied. "The document was signed on Tuesday at 8:14 in the morning at the primary maternity admissions desk," she snapped. "Excellent," I replied smoothly. At 8:14 on Tuesday morning, I was sitting in seat 12B on a Greyhound bus traveling through the state of North Dakota. I have the digitally tracked ticket stub, the credit card receipt for a coffee I bought at a rest stop 10 minutes prior, and the GPS location data from my cellular provider to prove it. It is physically impossible for me to have signed that pad in Seattle. The line went dead quiet. The condescending attitude vanished completely. "Now, Barbara, here is what is going to happen next," I continued relentlessly. "You are going to immediately secure and isolate the security camera footage covering the primary maternity admissions desk for the exact time frame of 8:10 to 8:20 on Tuesday morning. You are going to preserve that footage as physical evidence of a federal crime. My attorney, Jonathan Pierce, is currently drafting a legal subpoena for that video file. If you refuse to comply, or if that footage conveniently goes missing, I will not just sue your hospital for facilitating identity theft. I will personally drag your entire administration into a massive federal lawsuit for predatory elder financial abuse. Mr. Washington, I cannot just release security footage." Barbara stammered, her voice now shaking with genuine institutional panic. "That violates severe hospital privacy policies and HIPAA regulations. You will release it to my legal counsel, or you will explain to a federal judge why your hospital is actively protecting felons," I stated coldly. "I suggest you transfer this call to your legal department right now, Barbara. You are completely out of your depth." I hung up the phone and immediately texted Jonathan, telling him to send the subpoena to Seattle General Hospital. The hospital administrators were terrified of massive liability lawsuits. I knew they would hand over the footage rather than risk being named as accomplices in a federal fraud investigation. I waited in the dim motel room, pacing the worn carpet. Exactly 3 hours later, my laptop chimed with a high-priority encrypted email from Jonathan. The subject line read Seattle Hospital security footage. The body of the email contained a single sentence: "Leroy, you need to watch this immediately." I downloaded the file and clicked play. The video was high definition, perfectly clear without any audio. It showed the bustling maternity admissions desk. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen tick closer to 8:14. Then they walked into the frame. Kendrick and Megan. Megan was sitting in a hospital wheelchair, her face tight with anger. Kendrick stood beside her, looking incredibly nervous and agitated. The admissions nurse handed Kendrick the electronic signature pad and a plastic stylus. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes fixed on my son. Kendrick held the stylus over the glowing screen. He hesitated. He looked down at Megan, shaking his head rapidly. He was arguing with her, clearly terrified to cross the line into federal fraud. He tried to hand the pad back to the nurse, but Megan did not let him. Her face twisted into a mask of pure vicious rage. She shot up from the wheelchair, ignoring whatever physical pain she was in. She reached out and aggressively grabbed Kendrick's right wrist. She did not just yell at him. She dug her fingernails into his arm, physically overpowering his hesitation. She forced his hand down onto the electronic pad. Kendrick tried to pull away, but Megan gripped his hand tighter, wrapping her fingers completely around his. Together, they dragged the stylus across the screen. She physically guided his hand to forge my name. I paused the video, staring at the frozen image of my daughter-in-law violently forcing my son to steal my identity. The implications of this silent video were absolutely massive. Before this footage, I only had proof that Kendrick forged my signature. It was enough to send him to prison, but Megan could have easily played the innocent victim. She could have claimed she had no idea how her husband paid for the luxury suite. She could have walked away completely clean. But this video changed everything. Megan was not an innocent bystander. She was the driving physical force behind the crime. She had actively participated in the forgery. This elevated the crime from a simple financial dispute into a malicious, premeditated conspiracy. They were both guilty of medical fraud. They were both guilty of federal identity theft. The charges carried mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. The trap was no longer just for Kendrick. Megan had aggressively tied her own hands to the crime. They had both forged their own prison sentences. All I had to do now was let them wear their stolen crowns for a few more days before I brought the entire castle crashing down on their heads. It was Thursday morning, just 2 days before Megan was scheduled to host her massive VIP housewarming party. Inside their sprawling $1.2 million suburban mansion, Kendrick and Megan were living in a state of absolute blissful ignorance. They were surrounded by imported marble countertops, freshly unboxed designer furniture, and the arrogant satisfaction of a couple who believed they had successfully scammed their way into high society. I knew their exact schedule because Jonathan had mapped out every single financial deadline they faced. Megan was busy directing expensive floral arrangers and luxury catering companies, burning through cash as if it were endless. Today was the day their very first interest payment was due to Apex Capital Lending. It was a massive sum specifically structured to test the liquidity of high-risk commercial borrowers. But Kendrick was not worried. He was a man who thought he held all the cards. According to the financial surveillance Jonathan had running, Kendrick logged into the Apex Capital online payment portal right after his morning coffee. He was probably smiling as he typed in his routing number, fully expecting to use the remaining cash he had illegally siphoned from my assets to cover his monthly obligations. He selected his Platinum business account, hit submit, and waited for the confirmation screen. He was completely confident that his financial juggling act would hold up just long enough to impress his elite guests on Saturday. He had no idea that the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes had already vanished. While Kendrick was enjoying his expensive morning coffee, I was sitting in my dim motel room executing the most devastating financial strike of his life. I had my laptop open with Jonathan on speakerphone. We had spent the previous evening filing an official comprehensive fraud report with my primary banking institution and the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I submitted the high-definition security footage from Seattle General Hospital, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Kendrick and Megan had violently forged my signature to steal $22,000. I also submitted the fraudulent power of attorney paperwork Kendrick had used to liquidate my home and funnel $400,000 to Richard and Susan Gallagher. When a massive banking institution receives indisputable video evidence of federal identity theft and wire fraud involving hundreds of thousands of dollars targeting an elderly account holder, they do not issue a polite warning. They execute a total systemic quarantine. Because Kendrick had commingled the stolen funds with his own personal and business accounts, the bank flagged his entire financial portfolio as an active crime scene. "Jonathan," I said, watching the digital clock on my laptop screen tick closer to 9 in the morning, "has the bank initiated the total freeze? The quarantine is fully active." "Leroy," Jonathan replied, his voice crisp and intensely satisfied. The moment Kendrick attempted to process his mortgage payment to Apex Capital, the internal fraud algorithms locked onto his profile. Every single account with his social security number attached to it has been completely frozen. His personal checking is locked. His business operating accounts are frozen. His credit lines have been suspended. He cannot withdraw a single dollar, he cannot process a wire transfer, and he cannot even buy a cup of coffee with his debit card. The financial oxygen supply has been entirely severed. I leaned back in my creaky chair, letting the sheer power of that reality settle in. Kendrick had built a towering house of cards using my money as the foundation. By pulling out that single foundation, the entire structure was destined to collapse instantly. He thought he was a brilliant tech CEO, but he was just an arrogant little boy playing with stolen money. I wanted him to feel the exact same terror I felt when I stood in the freezing rain and realized my home had been sold. "Keep the pressure absolute, Jonathan," I instructed, looking at the peeling wallpaper of my motel room. "If he calls the bank, they are legally obligated to tell him only that his accounts are under investigation for federal fraud. They will not give him any timeline for resolution. Let him drown in the silence. Let him realize that he has zero control over his own survival." Back in his luxurious new kitchen, Kendrick was staring at his laptop screen in absolute horror. The online payment portal for Apex Capital Lending did not show a green confirmation checkmark. Instead, a bold red error message flashed across the screen indicating that his payment had been categorically declined by his financial institution. According to the tracking data, Jonathan was actively monitoring. Kendrick frantically tried to process the payment again. Declined. He switched to his secondary business credit card. Declined. He tried a personal platinum card. Declined. Panic began to set in. His hands were undoubtedly sweating as his heart hammered against his ribs. He was a man watching his life support system shut down completely. He picked up his phone and dialed his bank, but all he received was an automated message stating his accounts were locked pending a fraud investigation. But the declined transactions were only the beginning of his nightmare. Kendrick had willingly signed a predatory commercial loan agreement with Apex Capital because he was desperate. He had explicitly waived all standard grace periods. The contract clearly stated that if a payment was missed by a single minute, the debt acceleration and punitive interest clauses would trigger immediately. As the clock struck midnight that evening, the automated systems at Gwen Holdings executed the legal traps we had meticulously set. Because Kendrick had failed to clear his monthly payment, the system instantly applied the maximum penalty interest rate allowed by state law. But it did not stop there. The commercial contract included a severe default penalty fee for high-risk borrowers who missed their initial installment. At exactly 12:01 in the morning, Kendrick's phone buzzed with an automated email from Apex Capital Lending. In the span of a single night, while he was desperately trying to understand why he was suddenly locked out of his own money, his massive debt mutated into an uncontrollable monster. The missed payment triggered a brutal chain reaction, adding an immediate $50,000 penalty directly to his principal loan balance. His debt skyrocketed overnight, creating a financial hole he could never climb out of. He was trapped in a sprawling $1.2 million mansion with zero access to cash, mounting federal fraud investigations and a $50,000 penalty that was compounding by the hour. He was completely cornered with no way out. And the best part was that he still had absolutely no idea that his elderly father, sitting in a cheap motel room, was the silent architect of his total financial destruction. He was suffocating, and he was about to make the biggest, most illegal mistake of his life to try and save himself. The morning sun illuminated the mansion, but it brought absolutely no warmth to Kendrick and Megan. I sat in my motel room listening to the audio files Jonathan had forwarded to me from his private investigator. Megan had left the house early to finalize the catering and floral arrangements for her grand VIP party. She marched into an upscale event planning boutique demanding imported orchids, vintage champagne, and a custom ice sculpture. She expected to be treated like absolute royalty by the staff. When the total came to $12,000, she confidently handed over her platinum card. According to the store surveillance footage Jonathan had legally acquired, the cashier swiped the card once, then twice. The machine flashed a hard decline. Megan demanded they try another card. Declined. A third card. Declined. The cashier looked at her with that specific brand of polite pity reserved for people who are publicly failing at wealth. Megan completely lost her mind. She started screaming at the staff, accusing their machines of being broken and threatening to ruin their business. She stormed out of the boutique empty-handed and immediately called Kendrick. Her voice on the intercepted recording was shrill and completely unhinged. "Kendrick," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the background. "My cards are bouncing, every single one of them. The caterer is threatening to cancel our entire event. You promised me this party would be flawless. Fix this right now or I am taking Marcus and going to a hotel." Back at the mansion, Kendrick was already in a state of absolute terror. He had spent the last 2 hours on hold with his bank's fraud department. The customer service representative had bluntly informed him that his entire portfolio was locked down due to an active federal investigation regarding the Seattle hospital charges and the fraudulent power of attorney transfer. The bank explicitly mentioned my name as the primary victim. Kendrick connected the dots. He realized that the old man he thought he had discarded was the reason his financial life was suddenly bleeding out. The panic in his chest turned into furious, explosive rage. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed my number. I let it ring 4 times before I finally pressed the answer button. I did not say a word. I just waited for him to speak. Dad Kendrick yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic and fury. "What the hell did you do? The bank just told me you filed a massive fraud report. My accounts are completely frozen. Megan's cards are blocked. You need to call them back right this second and drop these ridiculous claims. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them I had your permission." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, letting his desperate screams fill the quiet space of my motel room. I took a slow, deep breath, slipping effortlessly back into the character he had assigned to me, the helpless, discarded old man, Kendrick. I rasped, my voice trembling and weak. "I do not know what you are talking about. What fraud report?" "Stop playing games with me, Dad," he roared into the receiver. "You called the bank. You told them I forged your signature at the hospital. You told them the house sale was illegal. Because of your stupid stunt, my entire life is locked down. Apex Capital just hit me with a $50,000 default penalty because my payment bounced. I am going to lose this house. You are ruining my family. Fix this right now." I let out a long, pathetic sigh. "Kendrick, how could I call a bank?" I whispered, sounding utterly confused. "You took all my documents. You took my home. You put me in this facility. I do not even have a real telephone in my room. I had to borrow this from a nurse. I do not have any power anymore, Kendrick. You made sure of that. Do not give me that garbage." He spat back, his breathing heavy and ragged. "Call the fraud department. Tell them you were confused. Tell them your memory is slipping and you simply forgot you gave me permission. If you do not clear this up today, Megan is going to cancel the party and take my son away from me." I leaned back against the cheap motel headboard, my face carved from solid stone while my voice projected total submission. "I cannot help you, son," I said softly. "I am just sitting here in this cold room. My arthritis is acting up and they have not even brought me my breakfast yet. The oatmeal was supposed to be here an hour ago. I am so hungry, Kendrick. Can you send me that $300 you promised? Maybe I can buy a warm sandwich." Kendrick let out a visceral scream of absolute frustration. "You are useless," he screamed. "You have always been completely useless. You are deliberately trying to destroy me, but I am not going to let you. I will fix this myself. I do not need you." He slammed the phone down, terminating the connection. I slowly lowered the device to the desk. A cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. He was exactly where I wanted him. He was frantic, angry, and watching his luxurious facade crumble into dust. When a narcissistic man is pushed into a corner with his ego on the line and his wife screaming in his ear, he stops thinking rationally. He stops calculating risk. He resorts to sheer, desperate survival. Kendrick was completely out of options. His personal assets were frozen tight. His credit lines were suspended by the fraud department. Megan was aggressively threatening to pack her bags and humiliate him by canceling the party of the decade. The $50,000 penalty from Apex Capital lending was compounding rapidly, and the eviction clauses were incredibly aggressive. He needed an immediate massive injection of untraceable liquid cash. Jonathan and I had carefully mapped out the architecture of his failing startup company. We knew exactly what accounts the bank would freeze, and we knew the one specific account they legally could not touch without a separate corporate warrant. It was the Employee Payroll Trust. By federal law, those funds were strictly segregated to ensure the remaining engineers and developers at his failing company received their wages. It was money meant to feed other families and pay other people's mortgages. It was highly illegal for any executive to touch that money for personal use. But Kendrick was no longer an executive making rational business decisions. He was a drowning man gasping for air. According to the digital trap Jonathan had established, we watched the network logs in real time as Kendrick logged into his startup's secure employee payroll portal. He completely bypassed the dual authentication warnings. He ignored the glaring red legal disclaimers stating that these funds were protected by the Department of Labor. He manually initiated a massive wire transfer. He drained the entire payroll reserve, routing every single dollar of his loyal employees' salaries into an offshore shell account and then immediately wiring it directly to the Apex Capital payment portal to cover his overdue mortgage and the massive penalty fee. He hit submit and finalized the transaction. I watched the confirmation code pop up on Jonathan's monitored tracking screen. Kendrick thought he had just saved his mansion. He thought he had just salvaged his party and appeased his furious wife. He had no idea that he had just crossed the absolute point of no return. By stealing the wages of his own employees to pay for his personal luxury estate, Kendrick had just committed undeniable federal embezzlement. He had handed me the final weapon I needed to destroy him completely. Kendrick had crossed the absolute point of no return by dipping his hands into his employees' payroll trust, but the financial hemorrhage was not contained just yet. Megan was still frantically trying to salvage her VIP housewarming party and maintain her illusion of high society dominance. With Kendrick's accounts completely frozen by the fraud department and his newly stolen payroll funds instantly swallowed by my holding company to cover his massive penalty fees, Megan had absolutely zero access to liquid cash. She did what entitled, manipulative children always do when they run out of other people's money. She called her parents. Through the sophisticated network of private investigators Jonathan had deployed, I received a detailed update on the exact movements of Richard and Susan Gallagher. They were sitting comfortably in the luxury downtown condominium that my sweat blood and 30 years of mortgage payments had paid for. When Megan hysterically explained over the phone that Kendrick's assets were locked down in a federal fraud investigation, Richard realized their free ride was in serious jeopardy. If Kendrick went down the money pipeline they relied on to fund their country club lifestyle would permanently dry up. But Richard thought he held the ultimate trump card in his hand. His name and his wife's name were the only ones legally listed on the deed to the $400,000 property. Richard immediately decided to play the financial savior. He contacted a high-risk real estate broker he knew from his previous bankruptcy proceedings. He desperately wanted to secure a rapid cash advance or a massive equity line of credit against the downtown condo. His plan was simple and entirely arrogant. He wanted to pull out $100,000 in clean, untraceable cash, hand it directly to Megan to fund her lavish party, and keep their wealthy facade completely intact. He figured he could quietly list the property on the private market, flip it for a sizable profit, and wash his hands of Kendrick entirely. He believed that because his signature was on the title, the origin of the funds simply did not matter. He thought his white-collar status made him completely untouchable. He was completely and utterly wrong. The very moment Richard's sleazy broker initiated a preliminary title search on the downtown condominium, Jonathan's elite legal team was instantly alerted by the county registry system. I was sitting at my motel room desk reviewing the latest financial intercepts when Jonathan called to deliver the news. Leroy Richard Gallagher is actively trying to leverage the property. Jonathan reported, his tone sharp-focused and entirely devoid of mercy. He is trying to extract a massive amount of cash to fund Megan's housewarming party and effectively launder the stolen money before the federal investigation catches up to him. He has a prospective cash buyer touring the property as we speak. "Shut him down, Jonathan," I commanded, my voice hard and unyielding. "Cut off his only escape route and make it as painful as legally possible." Jonathan did not hesitate for a single second. Within the hour, his team of corporate litigators filed an aggressive civil lawsuit directly targeting Richard and Susan Gallagher for the receipt of stolen property and acting as accessories to wire fraud. But the real death blow was the secondary filing. Jonathan secured an emergency lis pendens. It is a formal legal notice of pending action recorded directly against the property title. Jonathan dispatched a professional process server straight to the luxury high-rise building. According to the server's detailed field report, Richard was actively showing the condo to his prospective cash buyer when the heavy knock came at the door. The server handed Richard the massive stack of federal lawsuit documents and then firmly taped the bold, red legal notice directly onto his expensive mahogany front door. The document clearly and publicly stated that the property was an active disputed asset currently under federal investigation for money laundering and elder financial abuse. The prospective cash buyer took one single look at the words money laundering printed on the door and literally ran down the hallway toward the elevator. Absolutely nobody touches a commercial property tied up in a federal fraud dispute. In a matter of seconds, Richard's incredibly arrogant plan was reduced to absolute ashes. The luxury condo was completely and legally frozen. He could not sell it. He could not leverage it for a loan. He could not borrow a single dime against the equity. The $400,000 safety net he thought he possessed was instantly transformed into a massive legal anchor tied directly around his neck. Richard Gallagher was a man who operated entirely on undeserved pride and explosive rage. Stripped of his stolen asset and suddenly facing severe federal scrutiny, he completely panicked. He immediately called Kendrick and demanded to know exactly where I was hiding. Kendrick, eager to shift the blame away from his own failures, gave Richard the address of the depressing state-run nursing home he had originally banished me to. I knew Richard was coming. Jonathan had warned me that Gallagher had furiously left the downtown high-rise and was driving aggressively toward the suburbs. I put my worn-out work coat back on and took a cab directly to the facility Kendrick had selected. I walked into the grim, sterile lobby smelling strongly of bleach and boiled cabbage and took a seat in a stained vinyl chair near the main entrance. I reached deep into my coat pocket, clicked the record button on my digital voice recorder, and waited patiently for the storm to arrive. 20 minutes later, the heavy glass doors flew open. Richard marched into the lobby, his face flushed a deep purple with absolute fury. He wore a tailored golf shirt and a heavy gold watch that looked completely out of place in the grim, depressing surroundings. His eyes darted around the crowded room until they locked onto me. He stormed over, his breathing heavy and highly aggressive. He did not even bother to lower his voice. "You listen to me, Washington," he spat, standing directly over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate a man who spent 40 years building commercial skyscrapers. "I know exactly what you are doing with your cheap pro bono lawyer. You think you can freeze my property with your pathetic little fraud claims. You are ruining my daughter's life, and I will not allow it." I looked up at him, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. I let the heavy silence stretch, forcing him to fill the void with his own massive arrogance. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. He aggressively peeled off 5 $100 bills. He did not hand them to me. He threw them directly at my face. The crisp bills fluttered through the air and landed on the dirty linoleum floor right between my scuffed work boots. "Take this pocket change," he sneered, his voice dripping with venomous racial superiority. "Call off your garbage lawyer. Drop the lawsuit and retract your complaints at the bank today. You take this money and you stay in this pathetic facility exactly where you belong. You are nothing but an old black man trying to steal from your betters. If you do not withdraw those legal papers by noon tomorrow, I will personally make sure you never see the light of day again." Richard turned on his heel and marched out of the lobby, entirely convinced he had just asserted his absolute dominance and solved his problem with a handful of cash and a vicious threat. I did not move. I did not pick up the money. I just sat in the vinyl chair and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. The red recording light in my pocket blinked steadily. Richard Gallagher had just walked into a room filled with surveillance cameras and committed witness tampering, extortion, and a federally recognized hate crime. I reached down and picked up the 5 crumpled $100 bills from the dirty linoleum. I did not keep them. I walked over to the front desk, handed the cash to the exhausted receptionist, and told her to buy a catered lunch for the nursing staff. I walked out of that depressing facility and climbed into the sleek black town car Jonathan had waiting for me, idling right by the curb. Jonathan was sitting in the back seat holding a heavy encrypted hard drive that contained the entire digital footprint of my family's betrayal. We did not drive back to the motel. We headed straight downtown to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We were ushered into a secure conference room on the 10th floor. 2 federal agents were waiting for us, Special Agent Miller from the FBI White Collar Crimes Division and Senior Investigator Davis from the Internal Revenue Service. I sat across from them, placing the digital voice recorder directly on the polished mahogany table. I pressed play and let them listen to Richard Gallagher's racist extortion threat. Agent Miller's jaw tightened instantly. Jonathan then slid the encrypted hard drive across the table. It contained absolutely everything. The hospital security footage showing Megan physically forcing Kendrick to forge my signature. The fraudulent power of attorney documents used to steal my home. The wire transfer logs proving Kendrick funneled $400,000 to Richard and Susan Gallagher to hide their bankruptcy. But the most devastating piece of evidence was the corporate banking logs. The IRS investigator reviewed the printouts showing exactly how Kendrick had illegally bypassed federal safeguards to drain his employee payroll trust account. He had stolen the wages of his own workers to pay the $50,000 penalty to my holding company. That single desperate action elevated the case from a severe family dispute to a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scandal. Investigator Davis looked up from the documents and explicitly stated that Kendrick had also triggered massive tax fraud flags by moving those funds through offshore shell accounts. The evidence was absolute. It was perfectly documented, legally sourced, and completely undeniable. The trap I had been building piece by piece was now a fully weaponized federal case. My son, my daughter-in-law, and my arrogant in-laws had successfully committed a staggering array of federal felonies. They had handed the federal government everything required to put them in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. Agent Miller closed the thick file folder and looked directly at me. "Mr. Washington, this evidence is overwhelming," he said, his voice filled with professional urgency. "We have everything we need to secure arrest warrants from a federal judge within the hour. I want tactical teams dispatched to Kendrick's suburban mansion and the Gallagher's downtown condominium immediately. We can have all 4 suspects in federal custody before dinner time." He was ready to move. Federal agents do not like to wait when they have a solid case involving massive financial flight risks and severe corporate embezzlement. But I raised my hand, signaling him to stop. "Agent Miller, I respectfully request that you hold the arrest warrants until tomorrow afternoon." The agent frowned deeply, leaning forward in his chair. "That is highly irregular, Mr. Washington. Why would we give them another 24 hours to potentially destroy evidence or attempt to flee the jurisdiction?" I looked him dead in the eye. "Because right now they are separated and actively panicking," I explained calmly. "If you hit the downtown condo first, Richard Gallagher might manage to call his daughter. If you hit the mansion first, Kendrick might try to run. But tomorrow afternoon, you will not have to hunt them down. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Megan is hosting a massive VIP housewarming party at her new mansion. She has invited local politicians, wealthy socialites, and every single investor Kendrick has ever tried to impress. It is also functioning as a welcome reception for my grandson. Richard and Susan Gallagher will absolutely be there front and center, playing the role of wealthy benefactors. Every single person who stole from me will be gathered in one single room, wearing their most expensive clothes and drinking expensive champagne." Jonathan nodded in agreement. "It is the perfect containment strategy, Agent Miller. You can execute a flawlessly coordinated strike without any risk of a dangerous pursuit." Agent Miller looked at Jonathan and then back at me. A slow, understanding smile broke across the federal agent's face. He recognized the sheer tactical brilliance of the plan. "You want them exposed in front of their entire high society audience," Agent Miller said softly. "I want them to face the exact public humiliation they thought they could force onto me," I replied. Agent Miller nodded firmly. "We will execute the warrants tomorrow at exactly 3 o'clock. I left the federal building feeling a profound sense of closure. The heavy machinery of justice was finally in motion, and there was absolutely nothing Kendrick or Megan could do to stop it. I returned to my cheap, damp motel room for the very last time. I knew that tomorrow night I would sleep in my own bed again. I opened the small closet and took out the only garment I had brought with me from the storage unit. It was the tailored black suit I had worn to my wife Gwendolyn's funeral. It was a suit meant for deep mourning, but tomorrow it would serve a very different purpose. I spent the evening methodically polishing my leather shoes and ironing my shirt, making sure every single crease was sharp and perfect. Miles away in the wealthy suburbs, Megan was in a state of frantic, arrogant preparation. According to the ongoing surveillance updates, she was completely oblivious to the federal storm gathering on her horizon. She was aggressively directing caterers, arguing with florists over the exact shade of imported orchids, and making sure the massive crystal chandelier in her foyer was perfectly spotless. She believed that tomorrow would be her grand, spectacular coronation. She was convinced that standing in front of 200 VIP guests, she would finally cement her status as a wealthy elite. She thought she had completely discarded her inconvenient black father-in-law, leaving him to rot in a smelly state facility. She had no idea that her pristine $1.2 million mansion was legally owned by the very man she actively despised. She had no idea that her husband had bankrupted his soul and committed federal embezzlement just to keep the lights on for one more day. And she certainly had no idea that the federal government was currently polishing their handcuffs preparing to attend her lavish event. I set my alarm for early morning. I lay down on the squeaky mattress and stared up at the cracked ceiling. Tomorrow, 200 wealthy guests would arrive at that sprawling mansion, expecting a joyous celebration of massive financial success and a beautiful new life. Instead, they were going to get front-row seats to the most brutal financial and legal execution this city had ever seen. The housewarming party was not going to be a coronation. It was going to be a graveyard for their unchecked greed, and I was going to be the one to kick the first pile of dirt into their grave. The sun rose over Chicago, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on my final morning in that damp, depressing motel room. I stood before the cracked mirror and carefully slipped my arms into the tailored black suit I had worn to bury Gwendolyn 3 years ago. The fabric was heavy, woven with grief, but today it served as absolute armor. I adjusted my dark tie, brushing a speck of dust from the lapel. I looked at my reflection. This was not the attire of a defeated old man sent to rot in a state facility. It was the uniform of an executioner preparing to deliver a final, merciless verdict. I checked my inner breast pocket to ensure the certified legal documents were securely in place. The deed to the property, the frozen account statements, the federal identity theft reports. Everything was ready. I did not take the bus this time. I walked out of the motel and climbed into the back of a chauffeured jet black Rolls-Royce Phantom I had rented specifically for this occasion. If Megan wanted a display of high society wealth, I was going to give her a devastating masterclass. The driver, a quiet, professional man, pulled smoothly away from the curb and headed toward the exclusive gated community in the northern suburbs. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. As we left the gritty reality of the city and entered the manicured tree-lined streets of the wealthy elite, I watched the massive estates roll by. This was the world Megan falsely believed she belonged to. This was the world Kendrick had destroyed his own soul to buy his way into. We turned onto a private cul-de-sac, and the sprawling $1.2 million mansion came into view. It was an obnoxious display of new money. Dozens of luxury vehicles, including Mercedes, Porsches, and Range Rovers, lined the sweeping circular driveway. Caterers in crisp white uniforms scurried around the side entrance carrying silver trays of expensive food. Valets rushed to open doors for women draped in designer gowns and men wearing expensive heavy watches. The sheer arrogance of the entire scene was suffocating. Kendrick and Megan were actively funding this spectacle of massive excess with the stolen wages of hardworking tech employees and the liquidated legacy of my dead wife. My driver pulled the Phantom right up to the main entrance, bypassing the queue of lesser luxury cars. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the imported gravel. I sat in the plush leather seat for a moment, gathering the cold, relentless storm inside my chest. It was exactly 2:50 in the afternoon. The federal agents were 10 minutes away. The stage was perfectly set. I opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the driveway. I walked up the wide stone steps leading to the massive double front doors of the sprawling mansion. Before I could even reach the top step, 2 large private security guards in tailored dark suits stepped directly into my path. They crossed their muscular arms, forming a solid human wall blocking the entrance. They looked at my black funeral suit, noted the color of my skin, and instantly decided I did not belong at this elite high society gathering. "Excuse me, sir," the taller guard said, his voice laced with aggressive authority. "This is a private invite-only event. We are going to need to see your physical invitation and a matching piece of identification before you can take another step." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or act indignant. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit coat and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the heavy embossed seal of the county courts and the corporate watermark of Gwen Holdings. "I am not here as a guest," I said, my voice low, flat, and absolute. "I am the legal owner of this entire estate." I handed the top document directly to the guard. He frowned, taking the paper with a dismissive smirk that quickly vanished the moment his eyes scanned the bold legal print. It was the absolute proof of commercial foreclosure and immediate property seizure signed by a federal judge just 2 hours ago. It explicitly named Leroy Washington, chairman of Gwen Holdings, as the sole legal possessor of the property due to massive contractual default and corporate embezzlement. The guard's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked from the paper to my face, then down to my matching identification. The color drained completely from his cheeks. He suddenly realized he was not blocking a lost old man from a party. He was illegally obstructing a multimillionaire from entering his own legally seized property. "My apologies, Mr. Washington," the guard stammered, his voice dropping an entire octave. He frantically nudged his partner, showing him the embossed seal. Both men immediately dropped their arms, stepping back so fast they nearly tripped over each other. They bowed their heads, their arrogant postures entirely broken. "We were not informed, sir. Please go right ahead." I did not thank them. I snatched the document back from his trembling hands, tucked it securely into my coat, and stepped forward to grip the heavy brass handles of the double doors. I pushed the massive doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The interior of the mansion was a sickening display of stolen opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a warm, glittering light over 200 of the cities, most elite socialites, venture capitalists, and local politicians. Waiters weaved elegantly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar and expensive champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner of the massive living room. Standing near the bottom of a sweeping marble staircase, right in the center of the room, was Megan. She wore a stunning, custom-fitted white designer gown that probably cost more than my first car. Kendrick stood right beside her, wearing a forced, sweaty smile, nervously gripping a glass of champagne. Richard and Susan Gallagher were positioned prominently in the front row of the crowd, beaming with unearned pride as they soaked up the admiration of the wealthy guests. Megan tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the chatter, and the entire room fell completely silent. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. 200 pairs of eyes turned to look at my daughter-in-law. "Thank you all so much for coming today," Megan began, her voice projecting brightly across the lavish room. "Kendrick and I are incredibly blessed to welcome you into our beautiful new home and to introduce you to our son, Marcus." Looking around this room, seeing all of this, it is truly overwhelming. It serves as a beautiful reminder of what hard work, sleepless nights, and absolute dedication can achieve. We built this life from the ground up entirely through our own self-made success and relentless personal effort. I stood at the edge of the foyer, hidden in the shadow of a massive marble pillar, feeling the absolute disgust boil in my veins. She was standing in a house financed by my holding company, hosting a party funded by stolen payroll wages, and wearing a dress bought with the money she had stolen from an old man. She was looking 200 people dead in the eye and confidently calling it self-made success. I stepped out from the shadows and walked directly into the center of the grand foyer. I took a deep breath, pulling air deep into my lungs, and spoke with a booming, thunderous voice that shattered the elegant atmosphere of the room like a sledgehammer breaking solid glass. And the relentless effort of stealing $400,000 from me, too. The silence that followed my words was absolute. 200 of the most influential people in the city stood completely frozen like statues in a museum. Champagne glasses hovered inches from parted lips. The sheer shock of a man in a funeral suit crashing the most exclusive party of the season and accusing the hosts of massive theft shattered their pristine reality. All eyes darted from me, standing tall by the marble pillar, to Megan, whose triumphant smile had violently, completely dissolved. Her face drained of all color before instantly flushing a deep, furious red. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her diamond rings catching the light of the chandelier. "Security," she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical pitch that echoed painfully off the marble walls. "What is wrong with you people? I said no family allowed. Get this crazy old man out of my house right now. Throw him out into the street." But the heavy double doors behind me remained completely still. The two muscular security guards who were supposed to protect her elite gathering stood outside, staring at the ground, entirely refusing to step inside and challenge the legal owner of the property. Kendrick looked like he had just seen a ghost. The champagne flute slipped from his trembling hand and shattered against the imported marble floor, the sharp crash making several guests flinch. He recognized the black suit I was wearing. He knew exactly what it meant. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a waiter. His carefully crafted persona as a brilliant, fearless tech CEO completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified little boy caught in a massive lie. Dad Kendrick stammered, his voice barely a whisper but carrying through the dead silent room. "What are you doing here? How did you get past the gate? You are supposed to be at the facility." I did not answer his pathetic questions. I did not even look at him yet. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Megan as I walked slowly and deliberately into the center of the grand foyer. The crowd of wealthy socialites and powerful investors instinctively parted from me, stepping back as if my righteous anger were a physical force pushing them away. I stopped right in front of the main catering table, a sprawling display of expensive imported cheeses and a massive custom ice sculpture. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit coat and pulled out a thick stack of high-definition printed documents. I did not hand them to my son. I slammed them down onto the pristine white linen of the banquet table with a heavy, resounding thud. "Explain your self-made success to your guests, Megan." I commanded, my voice echoing with unyielding authority. "Tell all of these wonderful people how hard you worked to secure a luxury maternity suite. Tell them about the imported meals and the postnatal massages you demanded." Megan stared at the papers, her chest heaving as she tried to maintain her aristocratic facade. "You are insane," she spat, taking a step back. "I do not have to explain anything to you. You are nothing but a bitter old man trying to ruin my perfect day." I picked up the top document and held it up for the entire crowd to see. "It is a $22,000 medical invoice from Seattle General Hospital," I announced, speaking directly to the crowd of venture capitalists and local politicians who were currently funding Kendrick's lavish lifestyle. "My son and his wife banned me from the hospital room when my grandson was born. They told the nurses I was not welcome. But while I was sitting in the hallway holding a wooden crib I built with my own 2 hands, they were busy at the administration desk." I dropped the invoice and picked up a series of glossy photographs. They were the high-definition still frames from the hospital security footage Jonathan had acquired. I held the photographs high, slowly turning so the most important guests in the room could see them clearly. While I was traveling 23 hours on a bus back to Chicago, this self-made couple committed federal identity theft. I declared, my voice booming with absolute conviction. Megan forcefully grabbed my son's hand, wrapping her fingers around his. She physically guided his hand across an electronic pad to forge my signature. They stole my identity to finance $22,000 worth of hospital luxury because they did not have a single dime of their own. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. An older venture capitalist standing near the front row, a man who had likely invested heavily in Kendrick's failing startup, lowered his drink, his eyes wide with utter disgust. "That is a lie," Kendrick shouted, his voice cracking in absolute panic. He rushed forward, waving his hands frantically at his investors. "Do not listen to him. He is confused. He has dementia. We have doctors who can prove his mind is gone." "My mind is sharper than it has ever been, Kendrick," I shot back, cutting him off completely. "And the federal agents who reviewed the security footage yesterday afternoon entirely agree with me." The hospital turned over the tapes, Kendrick. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has every single frame. They know exactly whose hand was holding that stylus." The mention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation sent a shockwave of sheer terror through the room. Megan let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her hands as her knees visibly buckled. But the humiliation was not over. From the front row of the stunned crowd, Richard Gallagher suddenly shoved his way forward. Megan's father was turning a violent shade of purple, his neck veins bulging against his stiff white collar. His precious illusion of old money superiority was being systematically dismantled by an elderly black man in front of his elite peers, and his country club pride simply could not handle it. "You shut your mouth right now, you crazy old fool!" Richard roared, charging toward me with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I will not stand here and let you slander my daughter in front of these people. You are nothing but a poor, pathetic construction worker trying to extort us. I will have you thrown in a psychiatric ward where you belong." He lunged forward, raising his hand to physically strike me. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I reached into my coat pocket one final time and pulled out a heavy legal document adorned with a bright red federal stamp. Just as Richard brought his fist back, I aggressively slammed the document directly into his chest, forcing him to grab it to keep it from falling. "Go ahead and hit me, Richard," I challenged, staring him dead in the eye with absolute zero fear. "But before you do, you might want to read the federal seizure notice you are holding in your hands." Richard froze, his fist hovering in the air. He looked down at the document. The bold black letters seemed to drain the remaining life out of his body. "That is an emergency lis pendens order," I announced, my voice carrying to the very back of the silent room. "That $400,000 luxury downtown condominium you have been bragging about all afternoon, the one you bought with the money your son-in-law stole by illegally selling my home while I was grieving my dead wife." Richard began to shake violently, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text. "It no longer belongs to you," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "Federal authorities sealed the doors to your building 2 hours ago. You are completely locked out, Richard. Your fake wealthy lifestyle is over. Your property has been officially seized by the federal government for international money laundering and receiving stolen funds. You are entirely bankrupt, and you are completely homeless." Richard stood completely paralyzed. The federal seizure document shook violently in his hands as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed down upon him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply backed away, bumping into a catering table and knocking a silver tray of caviar onto the floor. But Kendrick refused to surrender. My son pushed his way past his shattered father-in-law and marched directly toward me. His face was a mask of desperate, sweating arrogance. He was a man backed into the ultimate corner, entirely unwilling to let go of the lavish illusion he had built. He turned his back to me and faced the crowd of wealthy investors and local politicians, waving his hands frantically to capture their attention. "Do not listen to a single word this man says," Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "This is exactly what I warned you about. My father is severely mentally ill. He is having a psychotic breakdown right in front of us. He does not own anything. He is a retired construction worker from the South Side who blew his meager pension, and now he is trying to extort me because he is jealous of my success." Kendrick spun around to face me, pointing an aggressive finger directly at my chest. "You have absolutely no power here, old man," he spat, his eyes wide and frantic. "You think you can walk into my home and intimidate me with fake documents. You think you can scare my guests. I bought this estate. I am the sole owner of this property. I did not need your pathetic retirement money to secure this house." He turned back to the crowd, puffing out his chest and desperately trying to salvage his reputation. "I am the chief executive officer of a rising technology firm," he declared, projecting his voice to the venture capitalists in the room. "I secured a massive $1.2 million commercial loan from a top-tier private equity firm. I negotiated the terms myself. I put my own company up as collateral. I financed this entire estate through Apex Capital Lending. It is an exclusive private commercial lender that only deals with high net worth individuals. My father does not even know how to spell private equity. He has absolutely nothing to do with this property or my wealth. I suggest you leave my house right now, Dad, before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not move a single inch. I simply looked at him with a cold, hollow pity. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Kendrick," I said, my voice dead calm. "You did sign a commercial loan agreement with Apex Capital Lending." Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the grand foyer swung open. The two private security guards immediately stepped aside, bowing their heads respectfully. Jonathan Pierce walked into the mansion. My attorney wore a bespoke charcoal suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. He moved with the predatory grace of a corporate shark entering a pool full of bleeding fish. The room fell into a stunned silence once again as Jonathan walked directly to my side, placing his briefcase on the very table where I had dropped the hospital invoices. "Allow me to introduce myself," Jonathan announced, his sophisticated voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "My name is Jonathan Pierce. I am the senior executive legal counsel for Gwen Holdings, a private commercial real estate and financial management conglomerate. I am here representing the sole owner and chairman of the board." Jonathan gestured respectfully toward me. Kendrick stared at Jonathan, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. "What are you talking about?" Kendrick demanded. "What does Gwen Holdings have to do with my mortgage?" "Everything, Mr. Washington," Jonathan replied, pulling a thick bound contract from his briefcase. "You see, Apex Capital Lending is not an independent financial institution. It is a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Gwen Holdings. And Gwen Holdings was founded 30 years ago by your late mother, Gwendolyn Washington, upon her passing total ownership transferred to your father." Jonathan took a step closer to Kendrick, holding the contract up for him to see. "When you desperately needed $1.2 million to buy this mansion because traditional banks completely rejected your failing credit, you went to the private sector. You signed an aggressive, high-risk commercial loan agreement. You were so blinded by your own greed that you never bothered to research the parent company. You borrowed $1.2 million directly from your own father. Kendrick stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fragile porcelain doll. He looked from Jonathan to me, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. "But that is not why we are here today," Jonathan continued relentlessly, his voice echoing clearly across the grand room. "2 days ago, Mr. Leroy Washington instructed my firm to freeze all of your personal and business accounts due to your involvement in federal identity theft. Consequently, your first scheduled payment to Apex Capital bounced." "I will pay it," Kendrick stammered, taking a step back. "I have the money. I just wired the funds yesterday. I paid the penalty fee." "Yes, you did," Jonathan agreed, a cold, ruthless smile touching his lips. "You bypassed the security protocols of your own tech company and drained your employee payroll trust. You stole the wages of your own engineers to pay your mortgage. That is a direct violation of federal labor laws. It constitutes massive corporate embezzlement." Jonathan dropped the contract onto the table. "According to Section 4 of your commercial loan agreement with Apex Capital, any borrower found committing corporate fraud or embezzlement immediately defaults on their loan. The contract dictates an absolute forfeiture of the collateral without any standard eviction grace period." Jonathan looked directly at Kendrick and Megan. "You do not own this house. You have zero equity in this property. As of this morning, a federal judge signed the immediate seizure order. This mansion legally belongs to Gwen Holdings. You are officially trespassing on my client's property, and you are ordered to vacate the premises immediately." Megan could no longer stand. The sheer weight of the absolute destruction of her life crushed her completely. Her legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the hard, imported marble floor, her custom white designer gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She did not scream. She did not yell for security. She just sat there on her knees, staring at the polished stone, her mouth wide open in a silent scream of total financial devastation. All of her arrogant boasting, her cruel manipulation, and her desperate obsession with high society status had instantly evaporated. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was a broke, homeless federal criminal sitting on the floor of a house she no longer owned. The reaction from the 200 VIP guests was immediate and utterly brutal. These were people who survived on reputation and status. The moment Jonathan announced the words corporate embezzlement and federal identity theft, the entire room turned against Kendrick and Megan. The wealthy venture capitalists who had been considering funding Kendrick's startup placed their expensive champagne flutes on the catering tables with loud, definitive clinks. They turned their backs on my son, refusing to even look at him. Local politicians quickly ushered their wives toward the exit, desperate to avoid being photographed at a party hosted by felons. The mass exodus began. The elite crowd moved toward the double doors, murmuring in disgust. They whispered about the sheer audacity of stealing from an elderly father and the absolute disgrace of emptying an employee payroll trust. No one offered Kendrick a word of sympathy. No one reached out to help Megan up from the floor. They looked at them like they were infectious diseases. Kendrick stood in the center of the emptying room, completely paralyzed. He watched his entire network of investors, friends, and socialites walk out the door, taking his future, his company, and his fake legacy with them. He was left entirely alone, surrounded by the expensive floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers he could never afford. Then a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the mansion. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance. Within seconds, it grew louder and more urgent, echoing through the manicured streets of the exclusive gated community. The sharp, aggressive wail of multiple police sirens cut through the quiet afternoon air. Red and blue lights began to flash through the massive front bay windows, casting a chaotic neon glow across the grand foyer. The authorities had not come to attend the party. They had come to end it. The wail of the approaching sirens shattered the remaining illusion of power inside that grand foyer. The flashing red and blue lights painted the pale walls of the mansion with chaotic, frantic strokes of color. Megan, who had been sitting paralyzed on the cold, imported marble floor, suddenly snapped out of her catatonic state. The sound of the approaching police cruisers seemed to violently jolt her back to reality. She slowly pulled herself up to her feet. Her pristine white designer gown was wrinkled and bunched, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess falling across her face. She turned her head slowly and locked her eyes onto Kendrick. The look on her face was no longer one of sheer devastation. It had mutated into pure, unadulterated venom. For years, Kendrick had sold her the narrative that he was a self-made genius pulling himself up from a working-class background. He had explicitly told her that his father was nothing but a broke, retired construction worker from the south side of Chicago, a useless old man who had blown his meager pension and had absolutely nothing to offer them. Megan realized in that very second that she had married a complete fraud. She realized that her husband had been so deeply arrogant and so entirely disconnected from his own family that he had no idea his father was sitting on a massive corporate fortune. If Kendrick had simply maintained a respectful relationship with me, they could have inherited everything legally. Instead, his aggressive stupidity and desperate greed had led them directly into committing severe federal felonies. Megan lunged at Kendrick with the ferocity of a trapped wild animal. She closed the distance between them in a split second, raising her hand and slapping him across the face with a sickeningly loud crack. The physical impact echoed through the grand foyer, causing the remaining guests to gasp and step even further away. "You lied to me, you pathetic loser!" Megan shrieked, her voice tearing through her throat. "You told me he was a broke old man with an empty bank account. You told me we had to take his house because he had absolutely nothing else. You absolute idiot. He owns a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. You dragged me into federal fraud to steal a house from a man who could have bought and sold us 10 times over." She did not stop with one slap. She began wildly striking his chest, clawing at the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. She beat her fists against him, screaming that he had completely ruined her life, her reputation, and her future. "You made me forge that document," she wailed, her tears ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks down her face. "You made me a criminal. You told me it was the only way. I am going to prison because you were too stupid to know your own father's net worth." Kendrick stumbled backward under the barrage of her physical assault. He raised his arms, attempting to shield his face from her manic scratching, completely unable to formulate a single coherent defense. He looked pathetic. He looked entirely broken. The brilliant technology chief executive officer was reduced to a cowering boy being publicly beaten by his hysterical wife in front of his wealthy investors. I stood perfectly still next to Jonathan, watching them tear each other apart. It was the ultimate collapse of a marriage built entirely on lies, manipulation, and an insatiable hunger for unearned luxury. Before Kendrick could even manage to push his screaming wife away, the situation escalated from a domestic brawl into a full-scale federal raid. The heavy screeching of high-performance tires echoed from the circular driveway outside. 5 distinct vehicles, 3 marked local police cruisers, and 2 unmarked black tactical SUVs slammed to a halt directly in front of the grand entrance, blocking any possible escape route. Car doors flew open simultaneously. The heavy thud of tactical boots hit the imported gravel driveway. The massive double doors of the mansion were not just pushed open. They were violently thrown apart, hitting the interior walls with a massive concussive bang. Special Agent Miller stepped through the threshold, leading a highly coordinated team of uniformed police officers and plainclothes federal agents wearing navy blue windbreakers with FBI printed in bold yellow letters across their backs. The overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement completely crushed whatever remaining atmosphere of high society elegance lingered in the room. The few venture capitalists and politicians who had not yet fled the property immediately pressed their backs against the walls, raising their hands slightly to show they were not involved. The string quartet musicians dropped their expensive instruments and scrambled into the corner. The flashing police lights reflecting off the crystal chandelier created a disorienting, chaotic scene. "Nobody move a single muscle." Agent Miller's voice boomed over the chaos, carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. "Federal agents, maintain your positions. Secure all exits." The tactical team fanned out across the grand foyer, blocking the front doors, the side corridors, and the main stairwell. Agent Miller marched directly into the center of the room, his eyes immediately locking onto Kendrick and Megan. The sheer force of the federal raid shocked Megan into silence. She froze, her hands still raised in fists against Kendrick's ruined suit. Kendrick slowly lowered his arms, his entire body shaking violently as he stared at the federal badge clipped to Agent Miller's belt. The lavish housewarming party, the event that was supposed to crown them as local royalty, was officially an active federal crime scene. Kendrick Washington and Megan Washington, Agent Miller announced, stepping directly into their personal space. "You are both completely surrounded. Do not attempt to resist." Kendrick let out a pathetic whimpering sound. His knees gave out and he dropped heavily onto the marble floor directly beside his wife. Megan stared at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Turn around and place your hands firmly behind your backs," Agent Miller commanded, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Kendrick Washington, you are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the illegal transfer of federally protected employee payroll trust funds. You are also being charged with federal identity theft and severe elder financial abuse." Two uniformed officers stepped forward, grabbing Kendrick's arms and roughly pulling them behind his back. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply. Kendrick began to sob aloud, begging the officers to let him call a lawyer, crying that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Then Agent Miller turned his attention to Megan. "Megan Washington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal identity theft, medical fraud, and accessory to massive wire fraud." "No!" Megan screamed, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek as an agent grabbed her wrists. "You cannot arrest me. I did not do anything. I am a mother. I have a newborn baby upstairs. My husband manipulated me. He forced me to sign those papers. We have high-definition security footage from Seattle General Hospital proving you physically forced your husband to forge the signature," Mrs. Washington, Agent Miller stated coldly, completely unfazed by her tears. "We also have the trust documents showing you actively received $400,000 in stolen funds. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately." The officer clicked the handcuffs tightly around Megan's wrists, securing them over the delicate silk sleeves of her custom designer gown. But the federal sweep was not finished. On the far side of the grand foyer, Richard and Susan Gallagher were quietly attempting to slip away. They were inching backward toward the catering kitchen, hoping to escape through the service entrance while the agents were focused on their daughter. They thought they could sneak out the back door, walk away from the mess, and somehow avoid the devastating consequences of their own greed. "Stop right there," Richard Sr., Investigator Davis from the Internal Revenue Service, called out, stepping out from behind a marble pillar and blocking the kitchen entrance. A second squad of agents moved in, surrounding the older couple. Richard Gallagher and Susan Gallagher, Investigator Davis announced, pulling out his own set of handcuffs. "You are both under arrest for international money laundering, conspiracy to commit tax fraud, and the knowing receipt of stolen property. We have the wire transfer logs proving you utilized stolen funds to illegally purchase a luxury condominium in the financial district to hide your active bankruptcy proceedings." Richard tried to puff out his chest, attempting one final display of arrogant superiority. "You cannot do this," he blustered, though his voice shook with undeniable terror. "Do you know who I am? I play golf with the mayor. I will have your badges for this." "You do not even own the golf clubs you play with," Richard Investigator Davis replied smoothly, snapping the steel cuffs onto Richard's wrists. "And as of 2 hours ago, you do not own a home either." The four of them, Kendrick, Megan, Richard, and Susan, were forcefully guided into the center of the massive room. They were lined up side by side, completely bound in steel chains. The ultimate high society family, the people who had looked down on me my entire life, were now thoroughly humiliated, stripped of their fake wealth, and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I stood next to Jonathan, perfectly composed, watching the culmination of my silent war. I had not raised my voice. I had not thrown a single punch. But I had taken back absolutely everything they stole, and I had systematically destroyed their entire world. The federal agents did not waste any more time. Agent Miller gave a sharp nod, and the uniformed officers began to forcefully march the four handcuffed suspects toward the massive double doors of the mansion. The physical reality of the cold steel around his wrists and the blinding flashes of the red and blue police lights reflecting off the foyer walls finally broke through Kendrick's thick wall of delusion. His luxurious world was completely evaporating right in front of his eyes. He was not walking out to greet wealthy venture capitalists. He was being dragged out to face a federal holding cell. Kendrick suddenly dug his expensive leather shoes into the polished marble, attempting to anchor his weight and resist the forward momentum of the arresting officers. He twisted his body around, frantically fighting against their iron grip. He locked his wide, terrified eyes directly onto mine. His face was completely soaked with sweat, and his chest heaved with violent, frantic sobs. The arrogant technology executive was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified boy who suddenly realized the massive, catastrophic scale of his own actions. "Dad," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail of absolute desperation. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. You have the power to fix this. Just tell them it was all a giant misunderstanding. I will give you everything back. I will sign the house over to you right now. I will pay you back every single cent I took from your retirement account. Just tell them to let me go." The officers pulled harder, but Kendrick dropped all of his body weight, refusing to walk, forcing them to drag him across the floor. He fell to his knees, his expensive tailored suit wrinkling against the hard stone. "Dad, please look at me," he begged, tears streaming down his face and dripping onto his pristine white collar. "I am your son. I am your only boy. Think about Mom. Think about what Gwendolyn would say if she saw you letting federal agents drag me away to prison. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Save me, Dad. Please, save me." The utter audacity of him invoking my dead wife's name to shield himself from the consequences of his own malicious greed extinguished whatever microscopic sliver of paternal sympathy I might have had left in my heart. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The two arresting officers paused for a brief moment, anticipating a father's final words to his ruined son. I looked down at Kendrick kneeling on the floor of a house he stole money to buy. I did not show any anger. I did not raise my voice. I looked at him with an absolute terrifying emptiness. "Do not ever speak my wife's name again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried across the dead silent room. "You traded your mother's legacy for a cheap illusion of wealth. You stole her life savings to buy the approval of people who secretly despised you." Kendrick shook his head wildly, continuing to sob. "I made a mistake, Dad. I was just stressed. I was trying to provide for my family." "You did not make a mistake, Kendrick," I replied, my tone completely merciless. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. You drove a knife into my back and then twisted it with a smile. I traveled 23 hours on a cramped bus holding a wooden crib I built with my own hands just to see my grandson. You stood behind a pane of hospital glass and watched your wife throw me out like a stray dog. You forged my signature to steal my retirement. And when I stood in the freezing rain staring at the sold sign on the home I built for our family, you coldly told me to go rot in a state-run nursing home. You offered me $300 a month out of my own stolen fortune so you could sleep better at night." Kendrick stared up at me, his mouth trembling, completely unable to formulate a single excuse. "You are begging me to save you because you think I am still your father," I continued, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute surgical precision. "But you are entirely wrong. My son died the very day he changed the locks on my home and left me standing in the freezing rain. I do not know the pathetic, greedy man kneeling on this floor. You are just a thief wearing my dead son's face." Kendrick let out a gut-wrenching, agonizing wail, collapsing forward until his forehead rested against the cold marble floor. He realized in that exact moment that he was completely and eternally severed from my grace. There would be no rescue. There would be no forgiveness. The officers firmly grabbed him by his shoulders, hoisting his dead weight back onto his feet, and began dragging him forcefully toward the flashing lights of the police cruisers waiting outside. As Kendrick was pulled away, Megan suddenly snapped. The sheer finality of my words to Kendrick, combined with the terrifying reality of her impending federal prison sentence, pushed her entirely over the edge of sanity. She thrashed violently against the grip of the female federal agent holding her, throwing her head back and screaming at the top of her lungs. "You are a monster," Megan shrieked, spitting the words at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "You planned all of this from the very beginning. You set us up. You are an evil, vindictive old man. I hope you burn in hell for ruining my life. I hope you die alone in this massive, empty house." I did not even blink at her aggressive cursing. I simply watched her thrash, knowing her words were nothing but the empty thrashing of a cornered animal. But her hysterical screaming triggered a chain reaction that completely shifted the atmosphere of the room. From the top of the grand, sweeping marble staircase, a sharp, piercing cry suddenly echoed through the massive foyer. It was a high-pitched, frantic wail of a newborn baby abruptly awakened by the chaotic shouting and the blaring sirens outside. Marcus. The sound of her crying infant struck Megan like a physical blow. Her furious cursing stopped instantly. The wild rage in her eyes was abruptly replaced by a sudden, paralyzing horror. She looked toward the top of the staircase and then back at the federal agents, her face contorting in genuine panic. "My baby," she gasped, pulling desperately against the handcuffs. "My son is upstairs in the nursery. You cannot take me away. I have to feed him. I have to take care of my baby. Let me go to my son." Agent Miller stepped directly in front of her, maintaining his stoic professional demeanor. "Mrs. Washington, you are currently under arrest for multiple federal felonies," he stated firmly. "You are going to be transported to a federal holding facility. You cannot take your child with you." Megan's eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. She looked over at her parents. Richard and Susan Gallagher were already being shoved out the front doors by IRS agents, their heads bowed in total disgrace. They were going to a federal detention center, too. Kendrick was already in the back of a police cruiser. There was absolutely no one left in her family to claim the child. "No!" Megan screamed, her voice tearing with raw maternal panic. "You cannot put my baby in foster care. You cannot hand my son over to the state. Please, I am begging you." Right on cue, a new figure walked through the open front doors of the mansion. It was a stern-looking woman dressed in a practical navy blue suit holding a thick clipboard. She was flanked by two local uniformed police officers. She walked purposefully into the grand foyer, surveying the chaotic scene with practiced efficiency. "I am Brenda Hayes, from the Department of Child and Family Services," the woman announced, her voice cutting through Megan's hysterical sobbing. "We were notified by federal authorities of a coordinated multi-suspect raid at this address. Since all immediate custodial parents and maternal grandparents are being remanded into federal custody, the state is taking emergency protective custody of the infant on the premises." Megan let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of a dying gasp. She dropped to her knees exactly as Kendrick had done, completely shattered by the realization that her greed had not only cost her her freedom, but had also stripped her of her own child. I stepped smoothly around Megan's kneeling form and walked directly up to the social worker. I did not act surprised or distressed. Jonathan and I had anticipated this exact scenario, and we had prepared accordingly. "Ms. Hayes," I said, projecting calm, absolute authority, "that will not be necessary. The child will not be entering the foster care system today or any other day." The social worker looked at me, evaluating my tailored black suit and my steady demeanor. "And who exactly are you, sir?" she asked, holding her pen over her clipboard. "My name is Leroy Washington," I replied clearly. "I am the child's biological paternal grandfather. I am the sole legal owner of this entire estate and the chairman of Gwen Holdings. I have a completely clean criminal record and absolute financial stability. I am here to take immediate emergency placement of my grandson." I gestured to Jonathan, who immediately opened his sleek leather briefcase and produced a thick stack of expedited legal documents. He handed them directly to the social worker. "These are certified emergency custody petitions pre-filed with the family court early this morning," Jonathan explained smoothly. "They include comprehensive background checks, financial affidavits, and a direct order from a family court judge prioritizing familial placement with Mr. Washington in the event of the parent's federal incarceration." The social worker carefully reviewed the documents, checking the judicial seals and the financial guarantees. The paperwork was absolutely flawless. She nodded, handing the petition back to Jonathan, and pulled a single emergency placement form from her clipboard. "Everything is in perfect order, Mr. Washington," the social worker said, handing me her pen. "Please sign on the dotted line to accept full temporary physical and legal custody of Marcus Washington." Megan watched from the floor, her eyes wide with a horrific, devastating realization. The man she had aggressively banned from the hospital recovery room. The man she had called a useless burden. The man she had actively conspired to leave homeless and destitute on the streets of Chicago. That exact same man was now standing in her foyer signing official government documents that gave him absolute total legal control over her child. I took the pen from the social worker and signed my name with a firm, steady hand. The loop of the L and the sharp slant of the W were perfectly rendered. There was absolutely no tremor in my hand. I handed the clipboard back to the social worker. "I will go upstairs and get my grandson now," I said quietly. Megan let out one final agonizing scream as the federal agents firmly grabbed her arms, pulling her up from the floor and dragging her out of the mansion. I did not turn around to watch her go. I walked toward the sweeping marble staircase, placing my hand on the smooth railing. I climbed the steps, leaving the flashing police lights and the ruined lives of the traitors behind me, moving steadily toward the sound of my grandson's cries, ready to finally bring my family home. 6 months passed since that spectacular collapse in the grand foyer of the suburban mansion. The federal justice system moves slowly, but when it finally strikes, it strikes with absolute and uncompromising finality. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, watching the judge hand down the final verdicts. Kendrick and Megan stood before the bench wearing matching orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains. The arrogant entitlement that once defined their every movement was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified look of the utterly defeated. The federal judge was completely merciless in his delivery. He explicitly cited their calculated malice and their utter lack of basic human decency. For federal identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and predatory elder financial abuse, he sentenced both my son and my daughter-in-law to 7 years in a federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Megan wept violently when the heavy wooden gavel fell. Kendrick simply stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking. I watched them being led away, and I felt absolutely nothing. They had aggressively dug their own graves, and now they had to lie in them. As for Richard and Susan Gallagher, their desperate, arrogant attempt to launder stolen money destroyed whatever microscopic shred of societal credibility they had left. The Internal Revenue Service seized everything they owned, down to their fake country club memberships and their leased luxury vehicles. They were forced into total, unmitigated bankruptcy. With their wealthy facade entirely shattered, their former high society friends abandoned them overnight, treating them like a contagious disease. Jonathan kept tabs on their situation for me. He recently reported that Richard and Susan are currently renting a tiny, dilapidated apartment in a high-crime neighborhood on the far southern outskirts of the city. Richard was forced to take a minimum-wage job sweeping floors at a local hardware store just to afford basic groceries, while Susan spends her days bitterly complaining to anyone who will tolerate her presence. They thought they could step on a working-class black man to maintain their grand illusion of wealth. Instead, they found themselves permanently banished to the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder they had spent their entire lives looking down upon. The universe has a profound and brutal way of balancing the scales of justice. With the criminals safely locked away behind concrete and steel, I turned my full attention to reclaiming my life and my legacy. The very first thing Jonathan did was legally invalidate the fraudulent sale of my lifelong home. Because the transaction was actively facilitated through a forged and maliciously utilized power of attorney, the entire real estate deal was legally nullified by a federal housing judge. The corporate development firm had absolutely no choice but to return the property deed directly to me. I did not keep the sprawling $1.2 million suburban mansion. I ordered Jonathan to liquidate that tainted property entirely and fold the massive cash return back into the secure portfolios of Gwen Holdings. That massive empty house meant absolutely nothing to me. I wanted my real home back. The day I moved back into my modest brick colonial house in Chicago, the air inside felt completely different. It felt clean and breathable. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my son's betrayal no longer haunted the rooms. I walked through the front door using my own heavy brass key, having personally ripped out the brushed nickel lock the moment I took legal possession of the property. I walked down the familiar hardwood hallway and opened the door to the spare bedroom. This was the room where my wife Gwendolyn used to sit late at night managing our finances and building the secret corporate empire that ultimately saved my life. It felt only right to honor her brilliant legacy by transforming her quiet sanctuary into a place of brand new life. I hired a professional team to paint the walls a soft, calming shade of green. I brought in the solid cherry wood crib I had carried all the way to Seattle and placed it perfectly under the large bay window where the warm morning sunlight pours in. I filled the room with picture books, soft blankets, and everything a growing boy could possibly need to feel loved and protected. This house was no longer a dark monument to the past. It was a bright, secure fortress for the future. Little Marcus adapted to his new environment beautifully. He has his grandmother's bright, observant eyes and a quiet, curious nature that fills the house with joy. Every morning when I wake up and hear his soft cooing coming from the nursery, the sharp pain of the last year fades a little more. I am no longer a discarded old man sent to die in a state facility. I am a father who found a second chance to raise a good, honorable man. But love without strict boundaries and protection is just another dangerous vulnerability. I learned that terrible lesson the hard way, and I absolutely refuse to make the same mistake twice. I sat down with Jonathan at my kitchen table and we drafted a comprehensive ironclad financial trust for Marcus. I transferred a highly significant portion of the Gwen Holdings commercial assets directly into this new private trust, ensuring my grandson will have his college tuition paid in full and a massive, solid foundation to start his adult life. However, I instructed Jonathan to weave the legal document with impenetrable, unforgiving clauses. The trust is strictly locked and professionally managed until Marcus turns 25 years old. Furthermore, there is one absolute non-negotiable condition written into the very fabric of the legal agreement. Kendrick and Megan are legally barred from ever acting as custodians for or benefiting from a single cent of that money. Even after they serve their full 7-year sentences and are released from federal prison, they will have zero financial leverage over their son. If they ever attempt to manipulate Marcus for cash or coerce him into handing over his assets, the trust automatically freezes and redirects the funds to charitable organizations. I made absolutely sure that the generational wealth Gwendolyn and I sacrificed to build will never be used to fund their toxic greed again. I completely secured my grandson's bright future while permanently starving their ruthless entitlement. It is a quiet Sunday afternoon now. I am sitting on the sturdy oak porch I rebuilt with my own hands, holding my grandson securely against my chest. The crisp Chicago breeze rustles the orange leaves of the old maple tree in the front yard. Marcus is sleeping soundly, wrapped in a warm blue blanket, completely safe from the chaos and destruction his parents created. I look down at his peaceful face and I feel a profound, absolute serenity that I have not felt in years. The journey to this moment was brutal. It forced me to face the horrifying reality that the boy I raised had become a greedy, malicious monster. But it also reminded me of my own unbreakable strength. Blood does not automatically make a family. Respect, loyalty, and unconditional care make a family. I spent my entire life working tirelessly to provide for my son, thinking my endless generosity would naturally make him a good man. But I learned a harsh, invaluable truth. A father's kindness must never be allowed to become the fuel for cruelty. If you give everything to people who value nothing, they will eventually try to consume you whole. I survived because I finally stood up, recognized my own worth, and fought back with everything I had. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you found value in my journey, please leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts on how I handled this situation. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice, resilience, and standing up for what is right. Stay strong, protect your peace, and always know your true worth. Goodbye for now. Another profound lesson I took from this entire ordeal is the sheer power of moving in absolute silence. In a world where everyone is desperately obsessed with showing off what they have, true strength lies in what you keep completely hidden. My son and his wife were totally blinded by their own flashy arrogance, underestimating the calculating mind of the man they thought they had broken. They mistook my old age for weakness, and my quiet nature for absolute surrender. But age brings a deep patience that greedy youth cannot comprehend. Never let anyone convince you that growing older means losing your edge. Share this video with anyone who needs a firm reminder that true power does not need to make a sound to be completely devastating.